Kicked out of home at 17, without any support. You won't believe what happened next. I don't know exactly when I started to feel like I no longer belonged in that house. Maybe it was during some silent dinner, while my father complained about my posture, and my mother looked at me as if I were a walking disappointment. I was the son who didn't fit in, the one who questioned too much, the one who wanted to live outside the perfect framework they so often displayed to others, while my peers dreamed of university entrance exams and prestigious careers. I dreamed of something simpler, but one that made my heart beat faster. Building things with my hands. I wanted to learn to work with wood, cement, tools, not out of rebellion, but because I felt alive doing it. But inside my home, the simple act of wanting to be different felt like an affront. Everything was a reason for discussion, and I felt like a stranger in my own home, trying to breathe amidst the suffocating expectations that never felt like mine. My name is Bernardo, and I was 17 when I realized my life was being planned without my input. My father, Carlos, was always a strict man, the kind who believed success was measured by titles and stability. For him, the only way to succeed was to attend a prestigious college, wear a suit, and work in an office. My mother, Helena, was different, but no less harsh. She manipulated with sweet words laced with venom, always reminding me of how much she had sacrificed to give me everything. And then there was my sister Lucia, who never got involved. She lived in her own bubble, accustomed to comfort and attention, while I was constantly criticized for every little choice. I was the problem, the one willing to take risks, the one who wouldn't accept the destiny laid out for me by others. My routine was a colorless cycle: school in the morning, prep school in the afternoon, fights at night. My father demanded results, my mother demanded behavior, and I tried to maintain my sanity. I studied out of obligation, not desire. I felt exhausted, empty, as if I were living someone else's life. Conversations at home always ended the same way: shouting, slamming doors, and that heavy silence that echoed in my chest. I tried to explain that my dream was to work in construction, to learn something practical, but they laughed as if it were a passing phase. "No one wins by getting their hands dirty, Bernardo," my father would say, and I swallowed my anger, trying to believe that maybe he knew more about life than I did. But the more I tried to fit in, the more I lost myself. It was in this whirlwind that I met Paulo, my best friend. He was different from everyone around me. He lived with his grandparents, worked part-time, and studied at night. He didn't have luxuries, but he had freedom, and that, for me, was everything. He listened to me without judgment, without trying to fix anything. One day, after seeing me angry about yet another fight at home, he said to me, "Dude, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just have to live your own way." These words echoed within me as a reminder that I had a choice. Paulo introduced me to a neighbor who did small construction jobs and invited me to help on the weekends. It was simple, heavy work, but every blow of the hammer made me feel alive. It was as if I was finally building something of my own, even if in secret. Those days became my refuge. While my parents thought I was in prep school, I was learning how to mix cement, build walls, and fix what was broken. And ironically, the more I built, the more I realized how much my house was crumbling. One day, I returned with dirty hands and a sincere smile. My mother noticed and asked where I was. I told the truth, and the silence that followed was more frightening than any scream. When my father found out, my silence felt like a crime. The tension at home began to build in a way I had never imagined. Each morning felt like a silent battle. My father, Carlos, stared at me as if constantly evaluating my loyalty, my intelligence, my morals. My mother, Helena, dropped indirect remarks that burned hotter than any open argument. And my sister, Lucia, simply watched, never getting involved, leaving me alone against a wall of criticism and pressure. Every choice I made was questioned, and even my small victories were devalued. I wanted to study something I truly cared about, to work in construction, to learn and grow, but they seemed to see only a threat to what they considered the perfect future. The feeling of not belonging, of not being understood, grew with each passing day, and I began to wonder if there was truly anywhere in the world where I could be myself, without guilt or shame. My secret work with the neighbors. Construction site became my only respite. Every wall built, every measurement taken, every hammer blow was a step toward myself, an escape from the emotional prison my home had become. But the freedom I felt outside also made me more vulnerable inside. The first time my father found out, the explosion was monumental. He screamed, accusing me of disrespecting the family, of disregarding the effort he and my mother had made for me. My room became a silent battlefield, filled with slamming doors and disapproving looks. I just wanted to be heard, to be acknowledged, but the words that came out of my mouth seemed to fall into a void, and I began to feel that perhaps the only way out was to actually leave. During that time, my relationship with Marina, my love interest, became an unexpected source of support. She wasn't just someone I liked. She was someone who truly understood my frustrations, who believed in me when I doubted myself. Our meetings were rare and discreet, but each conversation made me realize that I could dream without guilt, that I could chart my own path without fear of failure. Her presence gave me the strength to face the humiliations at home, reminded me that there was a world beyond my family's constant judgment. I began to see that my anger and frustration could be transformed into motivation, and that the weight of family expectations didn't have to define who I was or who I would become. But the tension reached a peak when my father decided I could no longer stay home. It wasn't an argument, it wasn't a fight, it was a sentence. He said I needed to learn the responsibility of choosing my own path, that I was being childish and ungrateful. My mother agreed, maintaining her manipulative and critical tone, making it clear that my wishes weren't important, that I only had value when I obeyed. My sister didn't even try to intercede. I was literally thrown out of the home that was supposed to be my safe haven. In that moment, I felt fear, anger, pain, a mix so intense it felt like my heart would burst. Everything I knew was being ripped away from me, and I didn't know if I could survive this feeling of emotional abandonment. Alone, with my things packed, and a whole world of uncertainty ahead of me, I realized that this expulsion, though cruel, could also be the opportunity I needed. I could finally seek the freedom I'd always dreamed of, but it would require courage, effort, and resilience like never before. It was at this point that I began to seriously reflect on my abilities, my talents, and what I truly wanted. Working in construction, which had previously been just an escape, began to become my life project. I needed to transform the pain of rejection into fuel to move forward. And even though I was afraid, a flame of determination began to burn within me, telling me that I could indeed rewrite my destiny. In the days following my expulsion, every step felt heavy. I carried my things, but mostly I carried the feeling of failure, the pain of rejection, and the fear of the unknown. My routine changed completely. Now I had to think about where to sleep, how to feed myself, how to support myself. The city, previously known only by the routes to school and prep school, became a new and intimidating territory. But there was one thing that didn't change: my determination not to give up. I remembered Paolo's words, who so often told me that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Every blow of the hammer, every brick laid in the work with the neighbor, now carried more weight than before. It wasn't just technical learning, it was the construction of my own value, my own path. It was also during this period that I got to know Donna Rosa better, our neighbor, a lady who always seemed to sense when something was wrong, even without hearing a word. She offered me simple but powerful advice. She spoke about patience, persistence, and listening to your heart even when everything seemed contrary. Sometimes she invited me for coffee. Other times, she just looked at me with that expression of someone who understands too much and judges too little. It was strange how such simple words could give me strength, but each piece of advice she gave became a small, emotional anchor. I needed these little anchors because alone, I often felt on the verge of giving up. Working with Mr. Jorge, my boss in my first formal job, also brought new challenges. He was demanding, but fair. Each task he gave me seemed to draw a roadmap to the independence I so desperately sought. There were moments of frustration when I didn't get something right, when I felt like I would fail, but he knew how to recognize effort and dedication. That taught me more than construction techniques. It taught me discipline, responsibility, and the value of persevering even when no one believes in you. Every time I received a compliment, no matter how small, I felt enormous relief. A confirmation that I could be someone worthwhile. Through it all, Marina remained my emotional refuge. Our conversations began to include more concrete plans, discussing dreams, considering technical courses, even construction projects we could develop together. She believed in me even when I doubted, and this faith was like a wind that pushed my courage forward. I began to realize that despite the pain of expulsion and abandonment, there were people who supported me, who saw my worth, and who were willing to walk with me toward what I truly wanted. This helped me realize that I didn't have to carry everything difficult alone. The intensity of loneliness and insecurity taught me lessons I never would have learned inside my parents' house. Every obstacle, every night of not knowing where to sleep, every moment I thought about giving up brought me closer to myself. I understood for the first time that overcoming pain isn't about ignoring it, but learning to walk with it, transforming it into fuel. My anger and frustration began to convert into motivation, and each step I took toward independence was a silent victory. I began to see that even if the world had rejected me in that moment, I could still create myself, build myself, and become someone I could respect and admire. Over time, I realized that each small achievement became gigantic compared to the difficulties I faced. Learning to fend for myself was painful, but liberating. Opening accounts, organizing my own finances, dealing with strangers, who were often as demanding as my parents, taught me responsibility in ways I never imagined. Waking up each morning without orders, making each decision without judgment, brought me a sense of autonomy that seemed impossible when I was still at home. Even when I missed the comforts of family, I understood that this discomfort was part of my growth. My relationship with Paolo and Marina strengthened during this period. They became more than friends or a girlfriend. They were pillars of support that reminded me of what I could achieve. Paolo always encouraged me not to give up, reminding me of all the times I had managed to deal with situations that were more difficult than they seemed. Marina supported me emotionally, but also helped me plan concrete steps for the future, always reminding me that there was no shame in starting small. Together, I felt less alone, less vulnerable. Their presence was crucial in preventing me from giving in to the despair that could easily have overtaken me. Learning to deal with my family's rejection was perhaps the greatest challenge. Every call I made to them, every occasional visit, reminded me of the emotional distance that existed. My mother remained critical, my father controlling, and my sister indifferent. But I began to realize that this rejection didn't have to define me. I could reconnect with myself, value my achievements, and pursue my path without depending on their approval. I understood that in order to grow, I needed to accept that some people can't or won't support us, and that this doesn't diminish our worth. Working with Mr. Jorge, my dedication began to shine through. He offered me bigger projects, greater responsibilities, and with each task well completed, my sense of competence grew. It wasn't just about making money, it was about proving to myself that I was capable of taking on challenges, learning quickly, and producing results that previously seemed impossible. Each completed project reminded me of what I truly wanted: to build something tangible, to create with my own hands, to feel proud of my effort. That sense of accomplishment began to fill the gaps left by my family's criticism and rejection. Looking back and realizing the distance I'd come to that point was surreal. From a pressured, suffocated, and rejected teenager, I became someone who finally breathed freely, even though I still carried scars. The pain of expulsion, the criticism, the family's indifference, all of it was transformed into fuel. I learned that life isn't about following other people's scripts, but about forging your own path, even when it's winding. And even though there were still moments of doubt and fear, I knew I had the strength and support to move forward, step by step, hammer by hammer, brick by brick, building not only projects but my own life. In the months that followed, I began to solidify my routine in ways I never imagined possible. Each day presented its own challenges: waking up early, planning what to do, dealing with clients and co-workers, learning new techniques, and coping with physical and emotional fatigue. But each achievement brought indescribable satisfaction. For the first time, I felt my life was in my hands, that my choices truly mattered, and that my efforts were producing tangible results. It was a sense of empowerment that nothing in the past had given me. Not good grades at school, not empty praise from my family. I was building not just concrete structures, but also my own emotional independence and self-esteem. My relationship with my parents never returned to its former state, but that didn't stop me from learning to deal with them in a healthy way. I understood that they had their own limitations and fears, and that control and criticism were manifestations of these. Instead of feeling defeated for not receiving approval, I learned to accept that not everyone can understand the path we choose for ourselves. Every conversation or encounter became an opportunity to affirm my own worth without needing their validation. This understanding was liberating and allowed me to move forward without holding grudges, but with awareness and maturity. The support of Paolo, Marina, and Donna Rosa continued to be essential. They reminded me daily that my journey had value, even when I doubted myself. Their encouragement helped me stay focused, invest in technical courses, improve my skills, and face unexpected challenges at work. I began to realize that true success isn't measured by the recognition of others, but by the ability to overcome obstacles, learn from them, and remain true to yourself. The confidence I was building within myself became my strongest foundation. Looking back today, I see that being expelled from my home was paradoxically the beginning of my true freedom. Every hardship, every night of uncertainty, every criticism that seemed overwhelming shaped me in ways nothing else could. I became resilient, independent, and capable of creating opportunities even in adverse circumstances. I learned that life isn't linear and that what seems like a disaster can turn into learning and growth. I transformed pain and frustration into determination, and that is the greatest victory anyone can have. The ability to rise up and move forward, even when all paths seem closed. The story doesn't end perfectly or with all its problems resolved. I still struggle with moments of doubt, longing for what could have been, and the complexity of family relationships. But today I know I can support myself, choose my path, and transform my life with effort and courage. The work I do every day, both at work and within myself, is proof that even in the face of rejection and adversity, it's possible to bounce back. This is the message I want to share. You can find strength within yourself, and even when the world seems closed, there's always a way to build your own future.
They used me and ignored me, but you won't believe how I changed my life. I always felt like I was living in the shadow of a life that wasn't mine. From a young age, my responsibilities were greater than my age could bear. Caring for my 4 siblings, organizing the house, and ensuring everyone had the bare minimum of comfort became the routine imposed by my parents, Emmanuel and Laura. I tried to find moments for myself, but they were rare and quickly interrupted by incessant demands. I remember sleepless nights, rocking my younger siblings while I tried to study for school exams. The feeling of invisibility was constant. I existed only to serve, without recognition, without genuine affection. And deep down, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness for not being able to be the ordinary teenager I saw in others. It felt like my life was permanently blocked, and my own voice had no space to speak. This was the reality I knew, and for a long time, I believed there was no other way to exist. My name is Julia, and this phase of my life happened when I was about 16. I was still attending public school, but I also worked at a small coffee shop to save money and feel some sense of independence. Back then, simply wanting to study at night without interruptions seemed like a forbidden luxury. My mornings were consumed by household chores, my afternoons by school, and my evenings by work. I felt that every step I took toward independence was met with hostility from my parents. There was always a sharp comment or unfair demand that reminded me, "You're still ours, Julia. There's no room for you to grow alone." Despite this, my desire to conquer my own life grew, and each small victory at work or school gave me a spark of hope, even amidst the exhaustion and feelings of invisibility. The conflict with my parents began with small arguments about schedules, responsibilities, and dreams. I wanted to study a little more at night, and they insisted that my priority was taking care of the house and my siblings. Every attempt to talk about my personal goals was met with criticism and contempt. For the first time, I felt the weight of frustration, the feeling of being trapped in a seemingly endless cycle. Anxiety began to consume me, and every task I completed was accompanied by a feeling of helplessness. Gradually, I began to realize that my own will was constantly ignored, that my voice had no place in the home. This created a silent tension that weighed on my shoulders and made me question whether I would ever be able to break free from this suffocating pattern. The feeling of being alone, even surrounded by family, began to grow. One of the most painful moments of this phase was realizing that my siblings, although they loved me, were also being conditioned to depend completely on me. I felt an enormous weight of responsibility, almost as if it were my duty to ensure they didn't feel neglected by my parents. This burden made me feel fear and guilt, a combination that left me paralyzed for hours. I wondered if I would ever be seen for who I truly was, a teenager with dreams, talents, and a desire to live my own life. I often cried in secret, trying to drown my despair and anger in silence, so that no one would notice my fragility. This phase was marked by endless nights, silent tears, and a constant feeling of emotional abandonment, even though I was physically surrounded by my family. The situation began to intensify when I decided I needed more autonomy. I began organizing my time to study and work, creating a small space for myself amidst the chaos. But my parents reacted with unexpected aggression. Every achievement of mine was treated as a threat, and any display of independence generated harsh criticism. The tension at home became unbearable. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, and my efforts to survive emotionally seemed invisible. It was at that moment that I realized I needed to seek help outside of that environment. I felt fear, but also a growing determination. I was beginning to realize that my life could not be limited to serving others and being ignored. Something inside me told me it was time for a change, even if the path was painful and uncertain. The decision to move away from my parents' house wasn't made impulsively. It took months of reflection, sleepless nights, tears, and fear of the unknown. I knew that by seeking my own autonomy, I might face rejection, even harsher criticism, and the feeling of being completely alone in the world. But the idea of continuing that suffocating routine began to seem unbearable. Working at the coffee shop, studying, and caring for my siblings was already exhausting. Living in an environment where my voice wasn't valued was emotionally draining. It was during this period that I realized my emotional survival depended on a drastic change. I began to imagine alternatives, people who could support me, until the idea of reaching out to my maternal grandparents, Nusa and Ricardo, emerged. They had always been a source of affection and security. but I hesitated for fear of disappointing my parents or facing unexpected rejection. Each step toward the decision required courage, but it also reminded me that I had the right to exist as an individual, with my own dreams and desires. When I finally made the decision to go to my grandparents' house, I felt a mixture of fear and relief. My parents' reaction was exactly what I feared: hostility and, contempt. I was accused of ingratitude, of being disobedient, of not appreciating what they had done for me. Each word felt like a knife wound, but at the same time, it gave me clarity. I could no longer depend on their recognition to live my life. With Nusa and Ricardo's support, I found not only a safe place but also people who truly listened to me, valued me, and encouraged me. For the first time, I was able to experience the relief of not having to be responsible for everything and everyone at once. The welcoming environment gave me the strength to reorganize my thoughts, set concrete goals, and envision a future that was truly mine. The feeling of freedom was strange, but at the same time, liberating. For the first time, I felt I could build my own identity without being suffocated by neglect or manipulation. During my first few days at my grandparents' house, I faced intense internal conflict. It was hard to believe I had finally found a safe space. I felt guilty for leaving my siblings and feared my parents would never accept me again. But Nusa and Ricardo's loving presence gave me perspective. They showed me that pursuing my happiness didn't mean abandoning my family, just establishing healthy boundaries. Over time, I began to organize myself, setting study schedules, planning my savings, and pursuing academic opportunities. Every small achievement was celebrated, and the sense of progress gave me the strength to face the difficult days. For the first time, I felt like my life had its own direction and that my choices truly mattered. This change in environment showed me that the right support makes a difference, and that when surrounded by people who believe in you, even the impossible seems achievable. One of the most important moments during this period was when I met my English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. She recognized my academic potential and encouraged me to apply for scholarships, opportunities that had previously seemed distant and unattainable. Her support was a turning point. I finally had someone outside of my immediate family who believed in me, who saw my capabilities and challenged me to grow. With each encouragement, I felt a greater confidence in my own abilities. I began to realize that my life story didn't need to define my future. I could write new chapters according to my choices and efforts. The simple act of studying with focus, doing exercises, and participating in extracurricular activities made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was a slow but steady process. Each step, each challenge overcome, built not only my knowledge but also my self-esteem and the sense that I deserved to find my place in the world. At the same time, my friendships with Megan and Casey became a fundamental pillar of emotional support. They helped me cope with moments of insecurity, doubt, and longing for my family, showing me that even in difficult situations, we don't have to face everything alone. Talking to them about my dreams and fears made the rebuilding process easier. The exchange of experiences and mutual encouragement allowed me to realize that, despite adversity, it was possible to maintain hope. I began to see myself differently, no longer as a victim of circumstances, but as someone capable of making decisions, facing obstacles, and building a path of overcoming them. This support network, combined with the welcome from my maternal family and Mrs. Rodriguez's guidance, gave me the confidence to take the next steps, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. Gradually, the feeling of helplessness was replaced by determination, and life began to take a clearer and more promising direction. Despite the welcoming atmosphere with my grandparents, homesickness and memories of my old home haunted me. Sometimes I found myself thinking about my siblings, feeling guilty for having moved away, even though I knew I was doing what was best for myself. The pain of separation was constant, and there were times when everything felt more than I could bear. I had to juggle work at the coffee shop, studies, household chores at my grandparents' house, and still deal with my confusing emotions. I felt overwhelmed, tired, and sometimes I considered giving up altogether. The nights seemed endless, and the fear of failure or not achieving my goals was suffocating. Anxiety consumed me, and I questioned my ability to move forward. Each obstacle seemed to grow in proportion, and the weight of responsibility on myself became almost unbearable. But there was something inside me, a spark of resilience, that reminded me why I had decided to change my life. It was a blend of hope, courage, and determination, even amidst doubt and discouragement. The academic challenges began to intensify. The tests, assignments, and the pressure to excel demanded an effort that, at times, seemed beyond my strength. Mrs. Rodriguez always told me I had potential, but the reality of fatigue and pressure made me question whether I could really do it. There were nights when I cried over books and notes, feeling the frustration of trying to juggle everything without making mistakes. However, every time I thought about giving up, I remembered my grandparents' confidence, my teachers' words of encouragement, and my friends' support. Gradually, I began to better organize my time, learn study techniques, and prioritize my tasks, but I still faced internal doubts and a constant fear of failure. It was a daily battle, an effort that required more than academic knowledge. It required emotional resilience and the inner strength to believe I could achieve my goals even in the face of such difficulty. At the same time, contact with my parents became tense and sporadic. Attempts at reconciliation arose, but each conversation felt like a test of patience and boundaries. They still held expectations that I should submit to their rules and accept the life they planned for me, with no room for my own choices. This conflict wore me down emotionally, and there were days when I felt torn between love and anger, between longing and the need for freedom. The pressure to prove I could follow my own path was immense. Every call or message from them made me reflect on who I truly was and who I wanted to become. It was a painful process of setting boundaries, learning to say no while maintaining respect and affection, without losing myself in trying to please everyone. The strength I found within myself began to solidify in this constant confrontation, demonstrating that my autonomy was not only desirable, but necessary for my own emotional survival. One of the most critical moments came when the opportunity arose to apply for a scholarship that could transform my academic life. However, the application process was intense and required complete dedication. For weeks, I woke up early to work, studied during the day, and spent hours at night filling out forms, writing essays, and preparing documents. The pressure was immense, and the fear of failure paralyzed me at times. I questioned whether all that effort would be worth it, whether I was capable of facing each challenge and proving to myself that I deserved this opportunity. The nights were long and lonely, and I often felt like giving up. But there was an insistent inner voice reminding me that each step taken was an achievement, however small, and that giving up would mean returning to a life of invisibility and imposed obligation. It was at that point that I realized that overcoming adversity isn't a single moment, but a sequence of choices, small decisions, and daily resilience in the face of adversity. My doubts and fears began to intensify, and there were times when I thought all my effort would be in vain. I remembered Megan and Casey's words, my conversations with Mrs. Rodriguez, and my grandparents' looks of pride. These thoughts were my foundation in the darkest days. I began to realize that, despite the fatigue and pressure, each challenge was an opportunity to prove my own strength. Despair nearly consumed me, but determination began to become a habit. Each task completed, each study completed, and each small step toward achieving my autonomy became personal victories. The feeling of being able to make my own decisions, even difficult ones, began to replace fear and insecurity. I realized that the turning point was happening silently, through the sum of small actions and conscious choices, and that my story could finally change course. When I finally received the news that I had won the scholarship, I felt a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. All the effort, every sleepless night, every doubt, and every tear seemed worth it. I remember calling my grandparents and hearing their voices filled with pride and emotion. In that moment, I realized that I was not only achieving an academic opportunity, but also reaffirming my ability to fight for myself. The feeling of validation was intense, but accompanied by a renewed responsibility. Now I had the chance to prove, especially to myself, that I could transform my life. Winning the scholarship didn't erase the traumas of the past, nor did it solve all the difficulties that would still arise, but it showed me that perseverance and determination have real power. From that point on, I began to see my future clearly, visualizing the steps I needed to take to continue growing, studying, and gaining independence. At the same time, I began rebuilding my relationship with my siblings. Even though we were away from my parents' house, we maintained constant contact, and I could see that they too benefited from my decision to pursue my own life. We began to talk more openly, sharing feelings and experiences. The feeling that I could still have a positive influence on their lives without carrying the full weight of responsibility was liberating. They became motivators and living reminders of why I was fighting, to show that it was possible to choose a different path, seek respect, and achieve my dreams, even when everything seemed to be against it. This connection strengthened my confidence and determination, allowing me to feel less guilty and more empowered, understanding that overcoming obstacles doesn't mean abandoning those we love, but learning to balance care and autonomy in a healthy way. Meanwhile, Megan and Casey's emotional support remained essential. Sharing my fears, insecurities, and achievements with them made each challenge lighter. Sometimes, a simple conversation or a gesture of encouragement was enough to renew my energy and remind me that I was not alone. I learned that seeking support is not a weakness, but rather a way to strengthen my resilience. At the same time, I began to approach problems more strategically. Planning, prioritizing, and making informed decisions became a constant practice. This approach not only helped me organize my academic life, but also prepared me to deal with the emotional and social challenges that arose. Gradually, the feelings of fear and insecurity gave way to confidence and determination, allowing me to see my achievements in a concrete way, even amidst persistent difficulties. A significant transformation also occurred in my relationship with my parents. Although the journey was slow and delicate, small signs of recognition and concern began to emerge. Laura, my mother, showed genuine concern at times, and Emmanuel gradually began to recognize my efforts. These changes didn't happen magically. They were the result of my firm stance and the intervention of Aunt Barbara, who helped mediate the dialogue and show my parents the mistakes they had made. I learned to balance compassion and firmness, recognizing that hostile people can evolve, but that my priority was my own life. This balance taught me valuable lessons about boundaries, forgiveness, and emotional resilience, showing me that overcoming also involves reconciliation and understanding, even when faced with those who have caused us pain. As time passed, my life began to reorganize itself in concrete ways. I studied diligently, developed professional skills at the coffee shop, achieved academic recognition, and built a solid and reliable support network. The feeling of being in control of my life was unprecedented and liberating. I finally saw myself as someone capable of transforming difficulties into opportunities, adversity into learning, and frustration into strength. I realized that the process of overcoming obstacles isn't about erasing the past or ignoring pain, but about using them as fuel to build something greater. A sense of personal pride and renewed confidence accompanied me daily, and for the first time, I felt that my future was in my hands, ready to be shaped by my determination and constant effort. With my routine finally organized and my academic achievements underway, I realized my life had truly transformed. The small daily victories, delivering excellent work, managing to save part of my salary, receiving sincere praise from teachers and friends, began to build a solid sense of self-esteem. Each step toward independence strengthened my confidence and my realization that I could truly be the protagonist of my own story. For the first time, I didn't need to depend on my parents' approval to validate my existence. Recognition came from people who truly cared, and above all, from myself. This sense of autonomy was liberating, and with it came the certainty that overcoming challenges isn't just about achieving external goals, but also about gaining the emotional freedom to decide who you want to be. My brothers remained a constant motivator, reminding me of the impact my choices could have. With every call, conversation, or visit, I realized I was contributing not only to my own journey, but also to inspiring those around me. The feeling that my actions mattered transformed my perspective. It wasn't just, about surviving or achieving an education, but about building a solid foundation of confidence, responsibility, and self-love. It was moving to realize that even in the face of a childhood marked by neglect and exploitation, it was possible to create new memories and relationships based on respect and support. This understanding reinforced my commitment to my own growth and the well-being of those I love. My relationship with my parents stabilized in a respectful way. I can't say all the problems disappeared, but there was a significant shift in the family dynamic. Emmanuel began to recognize my achievements, and Laura showed genuine concern, albeit still shyly. I learned that overcoming challenges doesn't require everyone to change immediately. Sometimes it's necessary to move forward firmly, establish clear boundaries, and, at the same time, cultivate empathy. This realization gave me emotional maturity, helping me deal with external expectations and stay focused on my goals. Today, I know it's possible to transform complex relationships without losing yourself in the process. Today, I share my story to inspire those who feel trapped or invisible, reminding them that even when all seems lost, it's possible to rewrite one's own path. I achieved my education, built solid relationships, and found a safe space to grow, learn, and dream. There are still parts of the pain that haunt me, but they don't define who I am or limit my choices. I've learned that overcoming challenges requires daily practice, conscious decision-making, and the courage to walk away from what harms us. My life today is proof that, with support, determination, and self-belief, we can transform obstacles into achievements, pain into learning, and frustration into strength. Each step of this journey reminds me that I deserve to be happy, that my voice matters, and that my story is mine to write, the way I've always dreamed. I lived for years trapped under the control of my mother and husband. No one would believe what happened. I woke up every day feeling an invisible weight, as if the whole world depended on my approval, on my willingness to please. It was strange, but that feeling that nothing was enough became so natural that I didn't even realize how much I was fading away. My mother, Lucia, had a way of controlling everything without raising her voice. A subtle comment, a demand disguised as concern, and I found myself chasing something I might never have. My father, Sergio, always hid behind silence, letting guilt and fear become my internal prisons. He never said anything, never intervened, and this made me feel alone even at home. I was in my early 20s at the time, working in a small office and dealing with clients. But otherwise, my life revolved entirely around pleasing and not bothering. Every word I spoke, every decision, seemed filtered by the fear of displeasing someone. The feeling of being constantly watched and judged was constant. At work, I smiled even when I felt exhausted. With friends, I said yes even when I wanted to say no. At home, the dynamic was even crueler. My mother criticized every step, every choice, and my husband, Andre, who started out as affectionate and charming, slowly showed signs of control, small coldnesses, and comments that made me doubt myself. Little by little, my voice disappeared. I lacked the courage to express my desires or opinions. Every time I tried to assert myself, I received stares, criticism, or silent disapproval. It was as if the world was forcibly molding me, slowly stripping me of my identity. I began to realize that I no longer knew who I truly was, because I had spent years living to please, sacrificing my desires. Life seemed safe and peaceful to the outside world, but inside, I was increasingly empty, tired, and suffocated. The first signs that something needed to change came from a friend, Tanya. She sensed my discomfort, my lack of spark, and spoke about emotional freedom as if it were a possible reality, not just a distant fantasy. At first, I laughed at myself, thinking the situation was hopeless. But conversations with Tanya began to open windows into my mind. Each story she shared, each subtle piece of advice, made me realize I was trapped in an unnatural cycle. I began to question myself. Would it always be this way? Would my entire life be about pleasing others? These questions, though painful, began to create cracks in the wall of submission that surrounded me. I was afraid to face what lay behind these cracks, but there was also a silent desire for freedom, something I hadn't yet had the courage to name. I remember one particular afternoon at work when I looked at my reflection in the shop window and almost didn't recognize myself. The woman looking back at me had tired eyes, a hunched posture, and a drawn expression. It was a shock. I realized that years of submission, fear, and the need to please had robbed me not only of my voice, but of my very life. That moment was the beginning of an inner turmoil. It was painful to admit that, for too long, I had allowed other people to define who I was and what I could feel. It was also the moment I began to wonder if I would be able to change, if I could finally rebuild myself. But the fear of confronting my mother, my husband, and even my own behavioral patterns was still immense. The internal tension began to grow. Yet, even with the fear, something inside me began to rebel. Small decisions began to become acts of silent resistance, saying no in small situations, expressing the smallest opinions, choosing an outfit without consulting anyone. Each act seemed insignificant, but it reminded me that I still existed, that my identity hadn't been completely erased. This realization brought a mixture of hope and anxiety. I knew the path would be long and painful, but I also felt for the first time in years that there was a possibility of finding myself again. It felt like being on the edge of a precipice, but with a spark of courage burning within me. The next period of my life was marked by a mixture of courage and constant fear. Every small decision I made to regain my voice seemed to trigger an unexpected reaction at home. My mother, Lucia, began to show signs of dissatisfaction, albeit subtle ones, as if my newfound independence were a personal affront. Andre, my husband, who had once seemed like a safe haven, began to display coldness in responses that had previously been affectionate. That sense of security I had vanished, replaced by tension and anxiety. I found myself walking a tightrope, trying to maintain my emotional balance while trying not to provoke family outbursts. Each small step toward my freedom seemed to cost me twice as much effort, and I often wondered if it would be worth it. It was like learning to walk again after years of emotional confinement, and the fear of falling paralyzed me, but there was something inside me that refused to give in completely. The feeling of loneliness was overwhelming. I felt as if I were silently fighting against invisible chains that bound me to patterns of submission I didn't even fully recognize. Tanya continued to be my anchor, the voice that reminded me there was life beyond this. Conversations with her were a refuge, but also a painful reminder of what I had lost through years of self-soothing. I began to question whether I would be able to break the cycle, whether I would ever regain my autonomy. Guilt and fear intertwined in my mind, suffocating. Every step toward freedom was accompanied by anxiety, and every step back into the old pattern brought me a sense of failure. The internal battle grew increasingly intense, and the feeling of near giving up began to visit me frequently. I reached a point where I questioned my own sanity. It was confusing to feel such a desire for freedom, and yet simultaneously fearful of losing it. At work, I tried to focus, but my mind constantly wandered between courageous decisions and thoughts of escape. At home, small arguments with Andre or indirect criticism from my mother turned into internal earthquakes, leaving me exhausted. The nights were the worst. Sitting in bed, unable to speak, I felt a tightness in my chest that seemed endless. I wondered, is it possible to change after so many years of submission? Can I trust myself to make choices without fear? The answer didn't yet exist, but the simple act of questioning was a step toward awareness and freedom. The tension grew with each passing day, and I knew something had to happen. It was during this period that I realized my small acts of resistance were no longer enough. Each time I gave in to pressure, I felt a piece of myself disappear. The need to please, which had previously been automatic, now became conscious, and it hurt. I began recording my thoughts, feelings, and desires, something that seemed simple but was revolutionary for me. Putting down what I felt and wanted on paper became an exercise in self-discovery. I noticed patterns, recognized manipulation, and understood how my own passivity had fueled those cycles of control. Journaling was a silent turning point, for it showed me that there was a self outside the influence of my mother and husband, a self that could still be rescued. The tension reached its peak one night when a small argument turned into a silent, hours-long confrontation. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Andre remained cold and distant, and my mother used every word, however indirect, to make me feel guilty. I felt on the verge of collapse, but something inside me refused to give in. A silent but firm voice telling me that I deserved more, that I didn't have to live trapped in fear and guilt. That night marked the point where I realized that my freedom wouldn't be granted, but earned, and that to achieve it, I would need courage, strength, and persistence. For the first time, I realized I was about to take the most important step of my life, to finally break the cycle that kept me trapped and begin to rebuild my identity. The turning point came on an ordinary morning, seemingly like any other, but ultimately extraordinary. I woke with a strange feeling, a mixture of exhaustion and determination. I looked in the mirror and for the first time saw myself through different eyes, observing not the woman who needed to please everyone, but the woman who wanted to find herself again. I remembered all the small flaws that taught me to hide my voice and my will. But this time, something changed. I felt there was no longer room for excuses or waiting for others' approval. It was at that moment that I decided it was time to act, that my life could no longer be shaped by the fears and demands of others. The decision wasn't grand or dramatic, but firm and silent, like a commitment to myself. I began to outline concrete steps to free myself, even though I still felt fear running down my spine. It was the first time in years that I felt in control of my own story. At work, I began to assert myself subtly, but definitively. I began to express my opinions, even though I trembled inside. Each small achievement brought me a sense of genuine power, something I hadn't felt in years. At home, the situation became a constant test. My mother made blaming and manipulative comments. Andre reacted with coldness and subtle criticism, trying to bring me back to my old patterns. Inside, anxiety and fear insisted on dominating me, but for the first time, I felt something stronger: self-confidence. I began to realize that freedom didn't come without resistance, but that it was possible to face it and grow with each challenge. Each choice to say no or stand up for myself was a silent but powerful victory that reaffirmed who I was. One of the most painful moments was facing my own guilt. For years, I was trained to feel responsible for the feelings of others, and this programming didn't disappear overnight. Every act of autonomy carried the weight of internal pressure, the fear of having harmed someone or of having failed as a daughter, wife, or friend. I felt like giving up many times, of returning to the comfort zone where fear was familiar. But something inside me kept insisting, you deserve to exist for yourself. The emotional pain was intense, but it also became fuel. Gradually, I realized that facing guilt and fear didn't mean being courageous without suffering, but allowing pain to be transformed into strength. Every tear shed, every moment of doubt, served to strengthen my inner roots. Tanya's support was crucial during this period. She became my external voice of courage, reminding me that I wasn't alone and that my struggle was valid. Our conversations helped me organize my thoughts, identify paths and strategies to face difficult situations without losing myself emotionally. More than that, she showed me that emotional freedom wasn't just about breaking up with people or situations, but about rebuilding my own self-esteem and self-confidence. I began writing letters that would never be sent, talking to myself, acknowledging my fears, and celebrating my small victories. This seemingly simple practice became a tool for reconstruction, allowing me to understand my patterns of submission and find alternative ways of reacting, making decisions, and expressing myself. It was the beginning of real transformation. Finally, the moment arrived when I had to confront Andre directly, without manipulation or mincing words. It was a long, tense, and emotionally charged conversation, where I finally made it clear that I would no longer accept the control, the coldness, and the silent pressure. He reacted with surprise and resistance, but I didn't back down. For the first time in a long time, I felt my body and mind aligned, working together toward my freedom. The feeling of fear was intense, but overcome by a solid determination. I was reclaiming my place in the world. That conversation was symbolic, because it represented the end of a cycle of submission and the beginning of my reconstruction. I left exhausted, but with a sense of power and hope I hadn't felt in years. The first great victory over myself and fear had been achieved. After that decisive conversation with Andre, I realized my life was beginning to change in concrete ways. It wasn't an instant transformation, but every action I took now carried the awareness that I had a choice, that my desires mattered. I began to set clear boundaries, communicate my needs, and most importantly, listen to my own voice. The feeling of reclaiming my identity was both liberating and frightening at the same time. Often, the fear of feeling guilty or disappointing someone still lingered, but with each small decision, that fear became more manageable. I began giving myself permission to exist without justification, and this brought a lightness I hadn't even remembered feeling. It was a gradual process, built with small steps that added up to significant achievements. My relationship with my mother remained challenging. Lucia didn't accept my changes well, and this created moments of tension. But instead of feeling defeated, I began to realize that her resistance didn't have to define my reaction. I learned to distance myself emotionally from manipulative comments, maintaining my composure, and reaffirming my autonomy. This ability to create internal boundaries was one of the greatest lessons learned. I began to realize that emotional freedom didn't mean the absence of conflict, but the ability to face it without being swallowed by it. Every conversation, every difficult situation was now an opportunity to exercise courage and self-confidence, reinforcing that I could exist on my own without fear or excessive guilt. At work, I began to stand out in a different way. I began to present my ideas with confidence, propose projects, and establish healthy boundaries in my daily routine. Colleagues noticed my change and began to respect me more genuinely. My self-confidence was reflected in concrete actions, demonstrating that my transformation was not only internal, but also visible externally. I felt proud of each step, but without deluding myself. There were still difficult days, emotional setbacks, and moments of insecurity. The difference was that now I knew I could handle them without losing myself. The sense of control over my life grew with each decision I made. Conversations with Tanya continued to be crucial. She helped me process emotions, analyze old patterns, and plan how to maintain the freedom I'd gained. I learned to recognize signs of manipulation and react consciously, without aggression, but with firmness. This learning gave me the confidence to create a broader support network, including friends and coworkers who respected my voice. I began to realize that emotional freedom was also about choosing healthy relationships and rejecting those who seek to impose control or guilt. This shift in perspective was liberating. My life began to be guided by conscious choices, rather than by the fear of displeasing. With each day, I felt my inner space expand. Simple activities like going out alone, taking courses, or deciding on my career without consulting anyone became acts of empowerment. I began to feel pleasure in small, everyday achievements, something that had been stifled by years of submission. The transformation was not only emotional, but physical. My posture changed, my gaze gained firmness, and my voice gradually returned, with courage and authenticity. Each day was a reaffirmation that I could exist without fear, that my life could be my own, and that I no longer needed to live under the control of others. The reconstruction was real, palpable, and profoundly liberating. Over time, I realized that my life had transformed profoundly and irreversibly. Each challenge I faced taught me something valuable about myself, my strength, and my limits. The freedom I gained didn't mean an absence of difficulties, but rather the ability to deal with them without losing myself. I learned to acknowledge my emotions without guilt, to value myself, and to prioritize my needs without fear of judgment. A sense of autonomy became part of who I am, and each conscious choice reinforced my identity. For the first time in years, I felt my life was truly in my hands. My relationship with my mother and husband changed, though not always harmoniously. Lucia remained controlling, and Andre still displayed cold streaks, but I no longer allowed them to determine my well-being. I created clear and firm boundaries and discovered that my inner peace depended more on my attitude than on theirs. This realization gave me the strength to stand firm in the face of old situations that would previously have crushed me emotionally. The freedom I achieved came not from their change, but from a change in myself, in how I saw myself, and how I reacted to the world. Furthermore, I reconnected with myself in ways I never imagined possible. I began to invest in my interests, hobbies, and dreams, activities that had previously been pushed aside due to the desire to please. Every achievement, no matter how small, was proof that I could exist without depending on others' approval. My self-confidence grew to the point where I allowed myself to dream again, to feel like I was in control of my own story. I discovered that true transformation happens when you learn to love and respect yourself, regardless of outside opinions. Sharing this experience with Tanya, close friends, and even online communities brought even more meaning to my journey. Realizing that my story could inspire others to break cycles of submission, I felt my pain transform into purpose. I learned that, although the journey is lonely at times, the courage to rediscover and rebuild oneself can generate profound connections and transformations. Each step taken, each challenge faced, reinforced that it was possible to break free and be happy, even after years of control and manipulation. Today, I can honestly say that my life has changed. Challenges still exist, but the difference is that now I have the tools, confidence, and clarity to face them. I discovered my voice, learned to respect my limits, and above all, to believe in myself. The freedom I've achieved is daily, and each conscious choice is a celebration of this victory. It's not a story of perfection, but of real courage, genuine overcoming, and self-love. Today, I finally know that it's possible to exist without fear and live for yourself, step by step, decision by decision. My family always ignored me, but wait until you see how I got my own life. For a long time, I believed my role in the world was to be someone's shadow. I grew up in a home where my brother's brilliance was almost a law, and silence was the space left for me. He was my parents' pride, their talent, their living joy. I was the proper, responsible daughter, the one who studied, helped, and didn't give them any trouble. While he received applause, I received advice about not showing off. I didn't understand what that meant. I only knew that somehow I needed to be smaller, and I molded myself to that. I hid in baggy clothes, avoided makeup, and kept my hair the same. Little by little, I became invisible, even to myself. And when you spend too much time invisible, you start to believe you don't deserve to be seen. My name is Isabella. I'm 27 years old. And for a long time, I lived with this feeling of being a blur in the background of other people's lives. I worked in a small clinic, studied at night, and rarely went out. My parents still treated me as if I were a fragile, opinionated girl. And I, without realizing it, fed this role. Living with my brother, Felipe, and his wife, Daniela, only reinforced this. They were always the center of attention at family gatherings. He, with his outgoing manner, and she, with her impeccable appearance and sharp remarks. I grew accustomed to being the target of veiled comparisons, and, in a way, I accepted it. But there came a time when this role began to suffocate. That's when I had to have eye surgery. Something simple, but it took me out of work for a few weeks. For the first time in a long time, I was alone with myself, without the demands of work, without the gaze of my family. Staring at the white ceiling of recovery was like staring into the emptiness of my life. I no longer knew who I was outside of the obligation to please. When I looked in the mirror after the surgery, I noticed something strange. My eyes were different, more alive, more awake. It seemed I could see the world, and myself, more clearly. It was during this period that something inside me began to change. I decided to cut my hair, a small change, but one that meant a lot. I remember my mother's look of astonishment when she saw me with my hair shorter and looser. She said, "Why change something that was good?" And I smiled, without responding, because, for the first time, I realized I didn't need her approval to exist. After that, I started taking better care of myself, not to please, but to recognize myself. I changed my baggy clothes, took a specialization course, and started going out on my own. The freedom at first was frightening, but gradually, the fear gave way to a feeling I had never experienced before: presence. The problem was that the more I found myself, the more it seemed to bother others. Daniela was the first to show it. She always had a subtle, almost rehearsed way of measuring me with her eyes. When she saw me for the first time after the change, she forced a smile and said, "Wow, you look so different." I understood her tone, and it was then that I realized that my transformation, which for me meant liberation, for her meant a threat. Little by little, the family atmosphere began to shift. Small comments began to appear, always shrouded in false caution. "Does this look suit you, Isa? Be careful not to seem forced." I pretended not to care, but inside I felt a storm brewing. Things got worse when preparations for my brother's wedding began. Daniela wanted everything to be perfect, and apparently, perfection meant I had to disappear a little more. She chose the bridesmaids' outfits, the colors, even the shade of nail polish. When she asked me to send a photo of the dress I would wear, I felt immediately uncomfortable. I sent a simple photo of a style I already owned, and she responded with a neutral emoji, followed by, "Maybe something more understated would look better on you, Isa. It's not your day, is it?" I read that message over and over. It wasn't just about a dress. It was a reminder of my supporting role, the very one I'd been trying to shed. I told my mother, expecting some kind of support, but she sighed and said, "Daughter, don't take it personally. Daniela just wants everything to turn out well. Don't complicate things." These words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Don't complicate things. It felt like a summary of my entire life. I was the one who shouldn't complicate things, shouldn't question things, shouldn't feel things. Meanwhile, Felipe kept saying it was better to let it go, that I was exaggerating. And perhaps I would have believed that if it weren't for Aunt Clara, she was the only one who looked at me sincerely and said, "Isabella, you don't need to diminish things to make anyone feel comfortable. That's not humility, it's erasure." From that moment on, something inside me clicked. I decided that at the wedding, I would be myself. No extravagance, no forcing, just me. I bought a dress that made me feel good, styled my hair the way I liked, and went. But as soon as I entered the salon, I noticed the stares. Daniela saw me, and for a second, her smile froze. Then she composed herself, but her discomfort was evident. Throughout the reception, I noticed the whispered conversations, the sidelong glances. When I went to greet her, she hugged me and whispered in my ear, "You could have been more simple, Isa. You're drawing." Unnecessary attention. I swallowed, pretending not to have heard. But inside me, something was beginning to break. The next day, my mother called me early. "Daughter, what happened to you yesterday? Danny was hurt. She thought you wanted to be seen more than she was." I was speechless. It was surreal to hear that. I tried to explain that I just wanted to feel good about myself, but she interrupted me. "Sometimes you need to know your place." That phrase echoed in my head for days. My place. I'd spent my life trying to fit into small spaces, and now I realized that was precisely what was stopping me from breathing. It was at that moment that I realized my fight wasn't against Daniela, nor against my parents. It was against everything I'd been taught to believe about myself. The family tension grew in a way I'd never seen before. Felipe began to distance himself, visibly torn between me and his wife. Daniela, on the other hand, subtly fueled the drama, always playing the victim, always hurt. My mother and father sided with her, telling me I needed to avoid conflict and be more understanding. I tried to remain calm, but I was exhausted. Sometimes I cried alone in my room, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. I didn't want to compete with anyone. I just wanted to exist without guilt. It was then that I realized that to achieve this, I would have to walk away. And perhaps that was the true act of courage I needed to perform. Deciding to distance myself from my own family was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There wasn't an explicit fight, nor a scandalous breakup. It was a silent, almost imperceptible withdrawal. I stopped attending Sunday meetings, stopped responding to the indirect messages, and began investing time in myself. At first, the guilt was unbearable. I felt selfish, ungrateful, almost like a traitor. But at the same time, there was a part of me that breathed a sigh of relief. For the first time, I had the right to exist without having to justify myself. Still, the loneliness was cruel. In the early days, the silence of the house felt like a reminder of everything I had lost, or thought I had. It was during this period that I began therapy. I needed to understand why it was so difficult to simply choose myself. The psychologist asked me a question that changed everything. Who is Isabella when no one is looking? I was left without an answer. I realized that my identity had been constructed based on others, on what my parents expected, what Felipe represented, what Daniela compared me to. I had never allowed myself to be just me, so I began to rediscover myself in small ways. Cooking while listening to music, going for a walk, reading books slowly. They were simple gestures, but charged with new meaning. I was, for the first time, choosing myself. Of course, it wasn't a linear process. There were days when everything felt like a mistake. Days when I'd pick up my phone to text my mom and delete it before sending it. Days when I'd dream about the past and wake up missing it. Not the coexistence itself, but the feeling of belonging, even if it was false. The pain of letting go is strange. It hurts, but it liberates. And I needed to accept that maturing also means losing certain illusions. One of them was that my family's love would always be fair. I discovered that sometimes you have to let go for love to become healthy again, or at least genuine. Over time, things began to reorganize. I returned to work with more energy, invested in courses, and met new people. It was during this process that I realized how much I had changed. People began to see me differently, not because of my appearance, but because of the way I carried myself. I spoke more confidently, looked people in the eye, and said no without justifying myself. And curiously, it was at this moment that my brother approached me. He said he missed talking to me and asked us to meet up. I accepted, but with a cautious heart. I knew the reunion would bring up old wounds. We met in a small cafe on a rainy afternoon. Felipe looked tired, unlike the usual confident man. He told me the marriage wasn't going well, that Daniela was more controlling and insecure than ever. "I think you were right about a lot of things, Isa," he said, his look a mix of regret and confusion. I listened silently. It wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about realizing that sometimes what destroys a relationship isn't hatred, it's imbalance. He confessed he felt trapped, that he didn't know how to cope. I felt compassion, not just for him, but for myself. for having carried for so long the burden of pleasing a world that never truly saw me. After that coffee, I spent days reflecting on my conversation with Felipe. For the first time, I realized that the favoritism that existed between us wasn't just his fault. It was a reflection of how we were raised. My parents projected onto him everything they admired and expected, while I was left with the role of balance, the daughter who couldn't make mistakes, who couldn't feel too much. He was shaped too, just differently. Understanding this didn't erase the pain, but it brought a kind of mature compassion, without naivete. I stopped seeing my brother as a rival and began to see him as someone who had also lost himself in the family's expectations. This brought me a new lightness. It was like letting go of a rope I'd been holding for years. A short time later, Daniela sent me a message. It was short, polite, and with a tone that mixed regret and defensiveness. If I made you feel bad, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to keep everything under control. I read it over and over again. I realized she wasn't truly apologizing. She was just trying to ease her own discomfort. Still, I responded sincerely. Don't worry, Daniela. Today I understand that control is a disguise for fear. She saw it but didn't respond. For once, this didn't shake me. I no longer needed her to acknowledge anything. The acknowledgement I needed was already within me. It was during this period that I began sharing a bit of my journey in online groups about self-esteem and personal reconstruction. I wrote about what I was experiencing, the doubts, the fears, the small victories. At first, it was just a way to vent, but over time, I realized that many people could relate. Some sent me messages saying they also felt excluded within their own families, that they were also trying to find themselves. I saw myself in them. And somehow, that mutual support became a mirror of healing. It was then that I realized, when we transform pain into sharing, the weight lessens. One day, my mother called me. Her voice was softer than I remembered. She said she missed me, that she wanted to see me. I was silent for a few seconds before responding. I wanted to see her again, but this time, in a different way, without the guilt, without having to justify myself. We made plans to have lunch. When I arrived, she looked at me for a long time, as if seeing me for the first time. "You look different," she said, and I smiled calmly. "I'm myself, Mom. That's all." It was a simple but deeply symbolic moment. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to please. And curiously, she seemed to respect that. That conversation with my mother was the moment I realized that overcoming doesn't happen on a specific day. It's built, silently, within us. I didn't go back to being the submissive daughter, nor did I bitterly break ties. I simply stopped accepting the role of shadow. There's still a certain distance, it's true, but it's a healthy distance, full of clear boundaries. Today, I understand that distancing myself wasn't selfish. It was self-care. And if there's one thing I've learned in this process, it's that it's not about proving who we are to the world, but about remembering who we are, even when the world insists on erasing us. Over time, I realized my life was beginning to expand in ways I never imagined. The freedom of not having to please everyone opened up space for my own choices. Professional, social, even personal. I began to allow myself small pleasures, like traveling alone, experimenting with new styles, and visiting places that had previously intimidated me. Every step I took alone was a reminder that my worth didn't depend on the gaze of others. I finally felt like I owned my own story. One of the most memorable moments of this new phase was reconnecting with my old friends, whom I had neglected for fear of not being enough. They welcomed me without judgment, celebrating my achievements and supporting me in my vulnerabilities. For the first time, I felt a true support network, based on respect, affection, and authenticity. That sense of genuine belonging was liberating. I realized that relationships shouldn't be burdensome or manipulative. They should nurture, not demand. My relationship with Felipe has also changed. It's not perfect, and there are still occasional tensions, but we've managed to establish a relationship of mutual respect. He's learned to recognize my autonomy and, in a way, has also grown with my courage to speak out. The emotional distance that once separated us has become healthy. I finally understood that loving someone doesn't mean submitting, and that familial love can exist without erasing individuality. Today, when I look back, I see an Isabella who survived neglect and comparison, who faced manipulation and insecurities, but who didn't let herself be defined by others. Every challenge, every malicious comment, every attempt at erasure was a push for me to better understand myself and become stronger. I learned that overcoming is not the absence of pain, but the ability to move forward, even bearing scars. That true victory is to exist authentically, without fear of being seen. I'm sharing my story now because I want others to feel that it's possible to bounce back, even in situations where it seems like everything is conspiring against you. It's possible to reconnect with yourself, set boundaries, truly love yourself, and above all, realize that your voice matters. I still deal with parts of the pain, but I've learned that I can live without diminishing myself. Today, I walk with confidence, knowing that my light doesn't have to dim anyone else's, and that finally, I can shine in my own way.
Betrayed by my own family, but I managed to turn things around, and you won't believe how. I always thought my life was under control. I had a solid career as a forensic analyst, a fiancé I loved, and a family I believed I could count on. But little by little, I began to notice small cracks, inconsistencies in my brother Raphael's finances, and strange behavior from Bianca, my fiancée. At first, I tried to ignore it, rationalize it, and convince myself they were exaggerated perceptions. But when I noticed suspicious transfers and misplaced documents, doubt turned into alarm. Something was wrong, and my instincts told me it wasn't just business, but personal betrayal. I felt isolated, unsure of who to trust, and this sense of powerlessness began to erode my daily life. I slept poorly, lost my appetite, and every small, familiar gesture became a reminder of the distance between me and the people who should have been there for me. The peaceful life I thought I had was disappearing, and with each passing day, I felt my own family turning against me. Tension mounted when I realized Bianca and Raphael were involved in something behind my acquaintance. The shock of the revelation was overwhelming. It wasn't just a romantic betrayal, but a family conspiracy that was isolating me. My mother, who had always favored my brother, seemed to approve of the situation, while my father remained proud of Raphael's success. I felt alone in what should have been my safe haven. The emotional pain became intense, a mixture of anger, sadness, and a sense of abandonment. Each day was an exercise in emotional survival, trying to cope with feelings that felt overwhelming. I knew I needed to act, but I didn't know how. The fear of making the wrong decision paralyzed me, and the thought of confronting this reality seemed nearly impossible. Receiving their wedding invitation and later my own mother's letter of disinheritance was a final blow. Every word of that letter pierced me, making it clear that my presence was unwanted and that my opinion didn't matter. I was faced with the need to decide between submitting to the humiliation or fighting back. The pain was so profound that I considered giving up everything, my family, my emotional ties. Each sleepless night increased my anxiety, and I felt isolated, as if the whole world were against me. The situation was painful and overwhelming, but deep down, something inside me refused to give in completely. It was during this period that my professional experience became my only safe haven. I began to thoroughly investigate Raphael and Bianca's finances, analyzing every document, transfer, and accounting report. Each discovery fueled not only my indignation, but also a sense of purpose. I could transform my pain into concrete action. The tension eased as I regained control, even if partial, over my own life. Each step I took in the investigation made me realize that justice depended not on my family, but on my own skills and determination. Despite this, loneliness still weighed heavily. Friends tried to support me, but few understood the complexity of dealing with emotional and familial betrayal simultaneously. It was a daily battle, staying focused, reviewing documents, coping with the emotional pain, and carefully planning each step. With each discovery, I felt a mixture of relief and pain. Relief at confirming my suspicions, and pain at realizing the betrayal was real. Even so, I realized that by transforming frustration into action, I was reconnecting with my own strength and rebuilding confidence in my abilities. My name is Eduardo. I was 32 years old when all this happened. My career was established. My love life seemed perfect, and my family was close. However, I discovered that the appearance of normality hid deep betrayals. The period that followed was an intense school of resilience. I learned that strength comes not from the absence of pain, but from the ability to face it with clarity and determination. Each accounting analysis, each piece of evidence collected was also a way of rebuilding my self-esteem and my identity. Before, my life was comfortable and predictable, but now I realized that true value lies in the ability to resist, to fight, and to claim dignity even when everyone seems to be turning against you. The investigation process required discipline and patience. Each document analyzed, each suspicious transaction reviewed, was a small victory that allowed me to regain some control over the situation. At the same time, I had to deal with the emotional toll of confronting people close to me, people I loved, who had betrayed me. It was a mixture of suppressed anger, profound sadness, and gradually intense motivation to restore my life. Each step in the investigation reinforced my conviction that my dignity could not be taken and that I had the right to act in defense of my own story. The sleepless nights continued, but now with a purpose. I woke up, thinking about the evidence, what still needed to be investigated, and how to present the facts clearly and organized. Each hour of study and analysis made me realize that I was capable of facing extreme challenges without losing my composure. Emotional control and technical discipline became essential tools for dealing with the situation of family and personal disrespect. The feeling of empowerment, though contained, grew as I documented every irregularity, every fraud, and every lie. My aunt, Adriana, became a pillar of support. She, who had always criticized my mother's favoritism, offered guidance and emotional support. Talking to someone who understood the situation without judgment was crucial. I learned the importance of seeking genuine support and recognizing that we don't have to face crises alone. Her presence bolstered my confidence and provided clarity on the need to act ethically and strategically. It was a reminder that inner strength is strengthened when there are reliable, even limited alliances amidst family chaos. When I presented the evidence to the authorities, I felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Each meeting, each document submitted, each testimony collected was a concrete step toward justice. The transformation from victim to agent of her own story began to take hold. For the first time in months, I felt the pain had a purpose, not only to expose the fraud, but also to reclaim my dignity and affirm that my voice and my truth matter, even when family members try to silence it. The unfolding of the investigations brought significant changes. Rafael and Bianca were held legally responsible, and the family's reputation began to crumble. But the greatest victory was internal. I had regained my self-esteem, my confidence, and my ability to cope with pain. I realized that true justice isn't revenge, it's ethical action based on facts and the preservation of one's own integrity. Each challenge I faced strengthened my resilience and clarity. About family and personal boundaries, I learned that it's possible to act against injustice, even when those closest to me are involved. The emotional transformation was gradual but intense. Before, I depended on my family's recognition to feel valid. Now, I understand that my strength comes from within. I learned to value my own choices, trust my abilities, and set healthy boundaries regardless of others' reactions. Emotional independence became a crucial achievement, allowing me to deal with the wounds of betrayal without being consumed by them. The sense of freedom that came with this realization was liberating, opening space for new, conscious decisions and strengthening my sense of self. Today, even when facing painful memories, I feel more balanced. I've developed resilience mechanisms, learning to transform pain into learning. Each challenge I faced has strengthened my understanding that I can overcome extreme situations and emerge stronger. more aware, and more connected to my own worth. Experience has taught me that overcoming pain doesn't mean the absence of pain, but the ability to transform negative experiences into emotional and personal growth, something that becomes visible only with reflection and the courage to face reality. The experience also impacted my professional life. I learned to deal with complex crises, maintain emotional discipline, and make difficult decisions under pressure. Each technical and legal victory strengthened my confidence and demonstrated that it is possible to reconcile ethics, competence, and personal strength amidst intense adversity. This confidence was reflected in my career and gave me the confidence to face other challenges, knowing that my skills are capable of generating concrete results, even in emotionally turbulent contexts. On a personal level, overcoming grief brought clarity about relationships and boundaries. I learned to identify toxic relationships and value those who offer genuine support. The initial pain still surfaces occasionally, but it no longer defines me. Now I can walk more lightly, setting priorities and maintaining my emotional balance without depending on the approval or recognition of those who have betrayed me. Each step of this process reinforced my understanding that personal strength comes from consistency, self-care, and the ability to act consciously in the face of adversity. The process of emotional reconstruction taught me the importance of patience and persistence. I realized that facing extreme adversity requires not only strength, but also planning, strategy, and the ability to remain calm in the face of injustice. Each step toward overcoming was the result of discipline, reflection, and courage. The experience showed me that there are no shortcuts to emotional recovery. It's a path that requires time, effort, and awareness of each choice. Understanding this helped me deal with frustrations in a healthier way and appreciate small daily achievements, even amidst pain. I've learned to deal with complex feelings without letting them overwhelm me. Anger, sadness, and resentment still exist, but I've learned to transform them into motivation and clarity of purpose. This ability to channel intense emotions into productive actions has become an essential tool for facing future crises, both personally and professionally. Each emotional challenge I've overcome has given me greater self-confidence, demonstrating that I can face adversity without losing my inner balance. This skill is something I know I'll carry with me forever, regardless of external circumstances. My relationship with my mother and father has changed. It's not about immediate reconciliation, but about understanding and establishing boundaries. I've learned that emotional integrity requires difficult decisions, such as distancing myself and defining priorities, even when it comes to family. This realization has brought a new sense of freedom and control over my own life, something I'd never experienced before. Recognizing that not all family bonds are necessarily beneficial was an essential step in my own evolution and emotional protection. Looking back, I see that every challenge I faced was an opportunity for growth. The initial pain, though intense, revealed my ability to endure, act, and transform an adverse situation into a learning experience. I discovered skills I never imagined I possessed and built a clearer worldview about justice, trust, and emotional autonomy. Each difficult experience served as a lesson, showing that overcoming obstacles doesn't depend on miracles, but on conscious action, courage, and perseverance in the face of adversity. Today, I share this story to inspire people facing betrayal, injustice, or family isolation. I want to show that even in extreme situations, it's possible to rise up, reclaim your dignity, and transform pain into learning. Overcoming obstacles isn't perfect, nor is it immediate, but it's real, practical, and profoundly transformative. It's proof that even in the face of betrayal and rejection, it's possible to rebuild your life with integrity, strength, and awareness of who you truly are. The resilience gained through this process has become part of who I am. I learned to trust myself, value my abilities, and realize that other people's approval doesn't define my worth. This understanding has changed my approach to all aspects of life, allowing for more informed decisions, healthier relationships, and a more solid perspective on future challenges. Every choice I make today is guided by experience, discernment, and the certainty that I can handle adversity without losing my essence. Today, I can deal with painful memories without being consumed by them. The wounds of betrayal still exist, but they have become a learning experience. Each challenge I faced strengthened my sense of identity, my ability to face crises, and my conviction that I am capable of overcoming extreme situations with dignity and clarity. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, but the gradual progress brought me confidence and emotional stability that previously seemed unattainable. Experience has taught me that true strength is not the absence of pain, but the ability to act even in the face of it. I discovered that true justice is based on truth and integrity, not on the humiliation of others. This learning has redefined my relationship with my career, my family, and myself, making me more confident, determined, and aware of my choices. Today, I can look back without destructive anger, but with gratitude for the lessons it taught me. Overcoming this situation brought emotional balance and clarity of purpose. I learned to set healthy boundaries, value genuine connections, and maintain my integrity, even when facing betrayal and rejection. This ability to rebuild is the greatest victory I've achieved, more meaningful than any legal outcome or external recognition. Knowing that I can rise again in the face of any adversity is something no one can take away from me. If I could summarize this entire journey in one lesson, it would be this: even in the face of the greatest adversity, it is possible to rise again, reclaim your truth, and transform pain into learning, strength, and personal renewal. Each obstacle overcome reinforces that life can be rebuilt with dignity and courage. Experience has shown me that we are much stronger than we imagine, and that true victory lies in continuing, even when all seems lost.
Betrayal and manipulation in the family. How I faced it all and discovered secrets I never expected. It was early November when everything began to quietly fall apart. I remember waking up every day with a feeling of oppression in my chest, as if the air were growing thicker with each passing morning. Nothing catastrophic had happened yet. No major loss, no major fight, no accident, no bankruptcy. But there was something, almost invisible, that seemed to corrode everything from within. It was as if my own life had lost its color, even though everything was in place. At the time, I lived in a well-located apartment, had been married for 5 years, and had a well-paying job. From the outside, everything seemed fine. Inside, the silence screamed. The days began to drag by as if I were walking with weights on my feet. And worst of all, I didn't understand exactly what was happening. When pain has no name, it seems to spread even further. I felt like a stranger within my own routine, within my own body, within my own home. My name is Bruna, and this is the story of the worst yet most transformative phase of my life. I was 33 when the truth began knocking on my door, or rather, seeping through the cracks. At the time, I worked as a communications manager at a solid company. I was known for being efficient, focused, and practical. I prided myself on being someone who kept my word, someone people trusted. But at home, things were more complex than I could admit. Raphael, my husband, seemed distant. He wasn't aggressive nor cold, just absent. I tried to justify it. It's work, it's fatigue, it's routine. But his absence began to become more present. His lost glances, the more frequent text messages, the excuses for not being home. I felt it, but I didn't want to see it, because seeing it meant accepting that something serious was happening. And at that point in my life, accepting any disorder was accepting that I had lost control. And control has always been my favorite disguise. It was during a seemingly ordinary Sunday that the realization came. We were at home, having lunch with Raphael's family. Carlos and Helena, his parents, were there, along with Livia, his adoptive sister. She was younger, about 7 years younger than Raphael, and had always been treated with great affection by everyone, including me. But that day, for the first time, I noticed something in the looks they exchanged. It wasn't sisterly affection. It was something else, a kind of silent tension, burning beneath the surface. I found myself observing too much, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But by the evening, the doubt had already taken root. I began noticing messages, actions, and laughter that I'd previously ignored, and each new detail pulled me deeper into a reality I didn't want to face. Raphael was being seduced, yes, but not by a coworker, nor by an ex. It was by his own adoptive sister, someone who grew up alongside him and now seemed determined to invade our space, our marriage, my life. At first, my mind tried to rationalize. She's young, she's impulsive, maybe it's just admiration. You're overreacting. I felt paranoid for suspecting something so absurd, but the more I tried to suppress my suspicion, the more it gained momentum. I began to notice how Livia was present in everything. She sent messages at odd hours, created excuses to come to our house, made comments about how Raphael was too special to be tied down so early. One night, he left saying he was going to take care of a matter at the family office. I decided to follow him, guided by something that, to this day, I'm not sure if it was intuition or pure desperation. I arrived at the building and saw them in the car, talking intensely with a closeness no sibling should have. In that moment, my world fell apart. I didn't scream. I didn't make a fuss. I just walked out of there, my legs shaking and my throat tight. This wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was a shattering of everything I'd believed was safe. It was the rupture of my sanity. I spent days not knowing what to do. I would wake up and wonder if it was all real, or if I was just creating a story in my head. I began to blame myself, reviewing every moment of the past few years, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. What had I missed? When had I become invisible in my own home? I wanted to talk to Raphael. I wanted answers, but at the same time I couldn't bear to hear confirmation of what I already knew. So I did what I always did when life tried to dismantle me. I went within. I locked myself in silence. I observed. I began to write down behaviors, dates, and speeches. I spoke to a close friend, sharing only the essentials. She looked me in the eye and said, "You're going to need to be stronger than ever." And that's when I understood that it wasn't just about saving a marriage. It was about saving myself. Because at that moment, the biggest risk wasn't losing Raphael. It was losing myself. I began arming myself with information and strategies, not to create an explosive confrontation, but to build a solid foundation on which to stand. I researched, observed, took screenshots, and saved messages and documents, all carefully to avoid discovery. The fear of becoming vulnerable was with me, but the desire to protect what I had built, my story, my marriage, was greater. It was a silent war, where I needed to be clever and firm, without losing my composure. I knew Livia's manipulations would not be simple, because she was a master at playing the victim and turning others against me. Her parents, who initially viewed me with suspicion and thought I was overreacting, became yet another obstacle. That family was divided, and I felt increasingly alone in the midst of the hurricane. At work, my emotions threatened to spill over at any moment, and I felt like a tightrope walker trying to hold everything together while my inner world collapsed. The nights were long, sleepless, and I spent hours wondering what to do. The temptation to give up, to pretend nothing was happening, was immense. I even thought that perhaps it would be better to accept the emotional betrayal and try to rebuild something different from it, even with a broken heart. But an inner voice screamed at me not to give in. That truth and self-respect must prevail. During that time, I learned that the greatest struggle was not against the other, but against my own fears and doubts. The feeling of impending loss threatened to consume me, but I needed to find the strength to resist. One night, after a particularly difficult day, I received an anonymous message with a recording showing a clear conversation between Raphael and Livia, where she tried to manipulate and seduce my husband, planning a future in which he would be far from me. It was as if someone had removed the blindfold from my eyes. The feeling of pain was immediate, a mixture of betrayal, anger, and helplessness. I could have given up at that moment. I could have thrown everything away and given in to sadness. But instead, I felt a spark of determination I hadn't known existed until then. I needed to use that evidence to protect what was mine and to ensure no one would doubt my word. That recording became the turning point. I finally had something concrete to use to face the situation, and most importantly, to face myself. From that moment on, I began seeking professional help. I sought out a therapist to deal with the whirlwind of emotions that consumed me. I discovered that talking about what I was experiencing helped me process the pain and develop strategies to move forward. Therapy was a turning point, as it allowed me to recognize patterns I hadn't even imagined existed within myself and my relationship. I understood that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, but rather an essential step toward healing. At the same time, I relied on the support of close friends, who became my safety net and emotional support. They helped me maintain perspective and not lose faith in my ability to start over, even when it seemed impossible. It was a slow process, full of ups and downs, but each small victory was proof that I could overcome. Despite the difficulties, I began to notice profound internal changes. My fear began to diminish, giving way to a new confidence I had never felt before. I gradually managed to establish clear boundaries with Raphael and his family. It wasn't an easy task, as the family dynamics were deeply ingrained, and I had to face criticism, judgment, and even veiled threats. But that new version of me wouldn't be intimidated. I began to respect myself more, to refuse excuses or justifications that hurt me. Each small gesture of self-care was a building block in rebuilding my self-esteem. There were still wounds, there were still doubts, but the feeling of fighting for something real and just gave me the strength to carry on. Little by little, the chaos began to transform into a solid structure, built with courage and determination. As I progressed on this journey of reconstruction, I began to notice that what had previously seemed like an isolated problem was much more deep-rooted and complex. The manipulation wasn't coming from Livia alone, but from an entire family system that for years had covered up and justified toxic behavior in the name of protecting a blood or adoptive bond. Carlos and Helena, who previously seemed to support me only superficially, began to clearly position themselves against me. I felt the weight of rejection, as if I were fighting invisible ghosts whispering that I was the villain of the story. But even in the face of this, I didn't give up. I used this emotional exhaustion to further strengthen my conviction that I deserved respect, love, and the truth. I didn't let the loneliness of the struggle consume me. On the contrary, it made me seek out my allies even more, the people who truly stood by me and wanted to see justice prevail. These were intense months of internal and external confrontation. Raphael, who had previously been passive, began to realize he could no longer hide behind silence and omission. I began presenting the evidence I had gathered gradually, at strategic moments, so there would be no room for lies or denial. It was a painful process because I still loved him, and even in the face of betrayal, I wanted to believe he could change, that he could acknowledge his mistakes, and that we could rebuild together. But I also knew I needed to be realistic, and that broken trust couldn't be repaired overnight. There were times when hope made me feel fragile, almost on the verge of giving up, and others when the pain of betrayal felt like an unbearable weight to carry. The balance between love and disillusionment became the most difficult battleground of my life. At that time, I realized how vulnerable I was to emotional manipulation, not only from Livia, but also from a pattern I had within myself of trying to please everyone and forgetting myself. This awareness was liberating. Understanding that I didn't need to bear the responsibility for other people's behavior gave me a new lease on life. I decided that my priority was to take care of myself, rebuild my self-esteem, and make it clear that self-love was the foundation of any healthy relationship. It was a learning process in which I needed to look within, honestly, accept my flaws, and understand that overcoming wasn't about being perfect, but about being true to myself. This internal shift began to reflect in all areas of my life, including how I positioned myself with Raphael's family and the difficulties that arose. Meanwhile, Livia wouldn't give up trying to destroy what I had built. Her obsession with her brother surpassed ethical and moral boundaries, and she became increasingly aggressive in her attempts to destabilize me. I discovered attempts to invade my privacy, false accusations, and even financial fraud against me, all to get me out of the way. It was an escalation that made me fear not only for my relationship, but for my physical and emotional safety. In those moments, I felt very small in the face of such evil, but it was also when I realized that true strength lies not in those who make the loudest noise, but in those who silently persist in seeking justice. I began gathering evidence for legal action, seeking legal support and protection. This part of the struggle taught me resilience, patience, and the importance of knowing when to ask for help. The legal process was exhausting and painful. I reviewed every moment of my story, every lie, every manipulation, with the calmness necessary to build a solid case. It wasn't easy facing Raphael in court, much less his parents, who still tried to defend their adopted daughter despite the evidence. But even in the face of exhaustion, I managed to remain firm and focused on what really mattered: the truth and my dignity. The trial brought consequences for Livia, who was officially disinherited and removed from her family, and a new stance for Carlos and Helena, who finally acknowledged my suffering and began to genuinely support me. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a concrete step toward a new beginning. I emerged from that phase with the certainty that, even in the most difficult situations, it is possible to rebuild and reinvent yourself, and that the strength to do so resides within each of us. After the legal process and the upheaval in family dynamics, my life began to take on new contours. I was no longer that woman who passively accepted silent injustices and disguised betrayals. The experience taught me the power of self-defense, not just in the legal sense, but in the ability to draw clear boundaries, to speak firmly about what is acceptable and what is not. This reverberated in all areas of my life. At work, for example, I gained a more assertive and confident posture, which helped me take on new responsibilities and even earn the respect of colleagues who previously doubted my capabilities. Overcoming the crisis didn't transform me into an unbeatable superhero, but it gave me a simple and powerful conviction that I deserve to be treated with respect, loyalty, and love. Self-care became a daily priority. I understood that taking care of myself wasn't a selfish act, but a vital necessity to move forward. I began investing in healthy habits, both physical and emotional, meditation, exercise, a balanced diet, and regular therapy. These small practices became anchors during turbulent times, reminding me that I was more than the pain I carried. Little by little, my self-esteem blossomed again, becoming more mature and resilient. I learned that my happiness didn't depend on someone else's approval or presence, but rather on my own commitment to myself. And this emotional autonomy was, without a doubt, one of the greatest victories I achieved. Reinventing. My life also meant rethinking what I wanted for the future. My marriage with Raphael underwent a slow and delicate rebuilding process. But above all, I began to see that my life couldn't revolve solely around him or anyone else. I began pursuing my own dreams, goals, and passions. I revisited old projects I'd put aside and allowed myself to try new things. It was a movement of freedom that brought me a renewed sense of purpose. There were still wounds, of course, but they no longer defined me. I was becoming someone capable of building happiness even after pain, of rising again even after a fall. This awakening was a beautiful and at the same time challenging process, requiring a lot of courage and self-love. Looking back today, I see that this journey was a testament to my resilience and the human capacity to overcome even the darkest moments. I won't lie, I still carry scars, doubts, and some unresolved pain. But what has changed is that now I know I don't have to carry all of this alone. I've learned to ask for help, to talk about my struggles, and to recognize that true strength lies in being vulnerable. My story isn't an example of perfection, but rather of humanity, full of mistakes and stumbles, but also of real and profound achievements. I hope sharing this experience inspires others to never give up on themselves, even when the path seems impossible. Life has a mysterious way of surprising, and overcoming obstacles is an act of courage that we can all learn to practice. As time passed, my relationship with Raphael transformed into something different from what I'd initially imagined. It wasn't a fairy tale, but a more honest relationship based on mutual respect, even if marked by the scars of the past. We decided together to take a step back, breathe, and reconsider whether it was truly worth continuing that marriage. This decision wasn't easy, because I deeply loved the person he was, but I understood that love alone isn't enough to heal wounds or guarantee happiness. We began to build a new kind of relationship, based on clear communication, respected boundaries, and above all, my priority of protecting myself emotionally. It was a daily exercise in patience, understanding, and self-love, which helped me grow as a woman and as a person. Reconnecting with my friends, those who have been with me since the beginning of the crisis, was another fundamental step. They were my support, my safe haven during the most difficult moments, and knowing I wasn't alone made all the difference. Sharing my experience with them, hearing other stories, and realizing I wasn't an isolated island in this struggle strengthened my sense of belonging and hope. Human connection, I've discovered, is one of the most powerful forces we have to weather storms. And that's precisely why I decided to share my story here, so that others know that, despite the pain and difficulties, there is a path to overcoming and to a life with more lightness and authenticity. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone going through a similar situation, it would be this: don't underestimate your inner strength. It's normal to feel lost, afraid, even think about giving up. I've been there, and I know how endless these moments can seem. But believe in yourself, seek help, build your support network, and above all, nurture your self-esteem. No betrayal or toxic situation defines who you are. What defines you is how you choose to react and rise after the fall. Every small step toward healing is a victory, and no pain is greater than your ability to rebuild yourself. This journey is yours, and you deserve to live it with courage and dignity. Despite all the pain and conflict, what I gained was profound self-knowledge. I learned to recognize my own needs, to put myself first without guilt, and to value my inner peace above any external expectations. Today, I feel stronger and more confident to face any challenge life brings me. I know there will still be difficult moments, but now I understand that they don't define me. They are part of a larger process, which includes growth, learning, and above all, self-love. This story I share doesn't have a perfect ending, but it does have a true ending, one that reflects my true journey and the hope I carry for the future. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my experience and hope it touches someone going through a similar situation. Overcoming adversity isn't a straight line, nor a magic formula, but a path made up of daily choices, the courage to face yourself, and the love to rebuild. If I could do it, you can too. Never forget, what truly matters is you, your dignity, and your ability to rise, even when everything seems to be falling apart. Life goes on, and the strength to start over lives within you. Thank you for listening and for being part of this community where we can be vulnerable and strong at the same time. We're on this journey together.
How I almost destroyed my family at 17 and discovered something that changed everything forever. Sometimes, when I look back, it's hard to recognize the boy I once was. I felt like the world was spinning against me, that every limit was a form of imprisonment, and that no one understood me. Today, writing this, I realize that much of what I called a lack of love was actually a desperate cry for attention, and an unwavering stubbornness in listening to those who wanted to help me. Back then, I only saw the pain, the anger, the revolt, and the person who suffered most from this was my mother, Eva. I thought she wanted to control my life, when in reality, she was just trying to protect me from what I was becoming. I was 17 when everything went completely wrong. My mother had remarried Rodrigo, a man I initially respected. He seemed calm and sensible, but as time went on, I began to see him as an invader. I hated the idea of sharing the house, the room, the routine, and even more. So I hated having to listen to advice from someone who wasn't my father. Meanwhile, the real one, Raphael, would show up every now and then with gifts, promises, and speeches, telling me I didn't have to accept this new family model. And I, hungry for approval, believed his every word. The truth is, I became an expert at manipulating situations. All it took was my mother raising her voice, and I'd run to my father, playing the victim. All it took was Rodrigo trying to talk to me, and I'd twist what he said to cause trouble. It was all a game, and I thought I was winning. The problem was, in this game, no one really won. The house became a battlefield, shouting, slamming doors, and resentful looks. I thrived on this tension because somehow it made me feel important. My behavior began to affect everyone. Rodrigo's son, Mateus, avoided me at all costs. My half-sister, Sophia, watched me like someone watching a stranger in their own home. I felt the discomfort, but pretended not to care. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, but it was easier to blame the world than to look at myself. My grandmother, Helena, always patted me on the head, telling me I just needed more freedom. And I clung to that to justify everything I did. My mother, on the other hand, became increasingly rigid, as if toughening up was the only way to keep from falling apart. I remember one particular night. It had been a nasty fight, the kind where no one listens. I screamed, said horrible things to my mother, and Rodrigo tried to hold me back as I slammed the door. I stayed out all night, just to prove that no one was in charge of me. Today, when I close my eyes, I can still see her face the next morning, tired, swollen from crying. And yet, she looked at me tenderly, asked if I was okay. I responded coldly, as if that gesture of love were weakness. Little did I know that that would be one of the last moments before my life turned around. The following weeks were chaos. I was completely blinded by my own emotions. Everything my mother said, I responded with sarcasm or provocation. When Rodrigo tried to intervene, I challenged him, just to see how much longer he could take it. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Even the silence felt heavy. And deep down, I knew I was the one fueling it, but I didn't have the courage to admit it. It was easier to blame my mother for being overbearing, Rodrigo for being invasive, and the rest of the family for not understanding me. I thought I was fighting for freedom, but I was actually digging my own loneliness. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon. I'd received a text from my father saying he had a gift for me, a motorcycle. My mother, of course, objected. She said it wasn't the right time, that I wasn't mature enough for it, and I exploded. She told me she just wanted to control me, that she had ruined my life, and that Rodrigo was a puppet. The argument got out of hand. I screamed, slammed the door, and ended up breaking a vase she loved. The sound of it shattering seemed to echo inside me. I locked myself in my room, furious, but for the first time, I felt an emptiness that the scream couldn't fill. In the following days, her silence was what hurt me the most. My mother didn't look at me the same way. There was no more scolding, no more arguing, just distance. Rodrigo also began to distance himself, trying to protect his children and his own peace. And I began to feel that somehow I was being swallowed by the weight of my own actions. But pride still spoke louder. I pretended I didn't care, that I had everything under control, when what I wanted most was for someone to pull me back. Only I no longer knew how to ask for help. It was my grandmother, Helena, who finally lit the fuse. She told my mother that the problem was her, that she was suffocating her son. That made my mother break down. I heard her cry, hidden in her room. I could have gone over there, hugged her, said anything. But I didn't. I stood there listening, convincing myself that she deserved that suffering. Today, I'm deeply ashamed of that memory. In that moment, I stopped being just a lost teenager. I became someone cruel, even without realizing it. A few days later, Raphael showed up. He said I could stay with him for a while, that things would be easier there. I accepted without hesitation. I packed my things and left without looking back. My mother didn't try to stop me, and that somehow hurt me more than any argument. I wanted her to hold me back, to say, "Don't go," but she just took a deep breath and said, "Go, Lucas. Maybe there you'll find what you're looking for." It was the first time I felt afraid of what I was doing. Living with my father seemed at first like the freedom I so desperately wanted. No rules, no demands, no disapproving looks. He treated me as an equal, as if I were an adult capable of making decisions. But I soon realized that in truth, he didn't care about my choices. He just wanted to use me as a tool to hurt my mother. Time showed that his gifts were traps. When I didn't meet his expectations, his tone changed. Criticism and venomous comments about Eva began, and I began to understand that there was something deeply wrong with that relationship. He didn't want to see me grow up. He wanted to see me as a weapon. Little by little, I began to miss my mother, The way she called me out, the food she cooked, even the arguments. I pretended not to, but each memory gnawed at me. Meanwhile, Rodrigo tried to text me, asking if I was okay, and I ignored him. One day, I received a photo. It was my mother in the hospital, her face drawn. The text simply said, "Stress crisis." It hit me like a punch. For the first time, I realized that my behavior hadn't just destroyed the harmony in the house, it had truly hurt those who loved me most. I tried to hide my anguish, but that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a weight I'd never felt before. It was guilt. Pure, silent, and devastating. I lay awake for hours, remembering every cruel word I'd said, every look she'd given me that I'd returned with contempt. In the morning, I asked my father to visit my mother. He refused, saying she was reaping what she sowed. And in that moment, everything became clear. I realized that this man wasn't my safe haven. He was the source of my chaos. That same day, I packed my things and left without saying a word. I took a bus back to my mother's house. When I arrived, Rodrigo opened the door. He was surprised but said nothing. He just let me in. My mother was lying down, pale, exhausted. When she saw me, she didn't say a word. She just cried, and I cried with her, as if all my pride had crumbled at once. I asked for forgiveness, for the first time, without trying to justify myself. I didn't know if she would forgive me, but I knew this was the first step toward change. From that moment on, I began a painful process of facing myself head-on. The psychologist my mother had tried to get me to see months before finally entered my life, and this time I went of my own free will. It was strange, uncomfortable, looking within and seeing how much I had hurt myself by trying to hurt others. Therapy made me understand how much I sought love through rebellion, and how anger was just a way to hide fear. Over time, I learned that being strong isn't about shouting louder or manipulating others, but about owning up to your mistakes and dealing with the consequences. It wasn't a quick process. There were days when I wanted to revert to my old ways because anger still felt comfortable, familiar. But every time I tried to deceive myself, I felt that emptiness in my chest, reminding me of what I'd lost. Little by little, I began to rebuild trust with my mother. It wasn't magic. We started with small conversations, brief moments, but full of sincerity. I finally listened, and she listened to me without rushing or judging. Rodrigo, little by little, also entered this new chapter. He didn't become my best friend, but he began to treat me with respect, as someone learning to be responsible. I learned to appreciate his efforts, and this led to a drastic reduction in our arguments. I realized that I often saw his authority as imposition, when in fact he was just trying to maintain harmony. Recognizing this was a huge step in my maturity. With Mateus and Sophia, it was simpler than I imagined. I began to understand that they weren't my enemies, just people trying to live their own lives. Learning to deal with Raphael was another difficult chapter. He still tried to lure me with gifts and promises, but I learned to recognize his intentions. It wasn't easy to resist, especially after years of manipulation, but I finally realized that choosing what's healthy for me is much more important than pleasing someone who only wants to exploit my emotions. My mother taught me that boundaries aren't barriers, but bridges to growth. Accepting this was liberating. My relationship with my mother was never perfect, and there are still tense moments. But today, I can communicate without resorting to anger or sarcasm. I've discovered that trust is rebuilt with small actions, with patience, and with constant presence. You don't erase the past, but you learn to transform it into learning. Today I can look at her and feel gratitude, not just anger or resentment. Family life still has challenges, but they are manageable, because now I participate consciously, not just react. The most important thing I learned on this journey is that true growth comes from within. It's not about showing strength or manipulating, but about the courage to face your own flaws. Today, I feel more whole, more human, and above all, capable of loving without trying to control. The wounds exist, but they no longer define who I am. My past shaped me, but my choice to change is what gives me real power. Every step I took toward maturity was a silent victory that no one could take away from me, and it's this sense of achievement that I carry to this day. Looking back, I realize my life was a tangle of misguided choices, misinterpreted pride and fear. Every argument, every manipulation, every night I slammed the door or screamed, all of it shaped me in ways I couldn't understand at the time. I was blind, trapped by my emotions and the false idea of freedom. But the truth is, freedom doesn't exist without responsibility. Only when I accepted my flaws was I able to see the path to rebuilding. Today, I can see my mother not as someone who limited me, but as someone who loved me intensely, even when I couldn't recognize it. I learned the importance of listening before reacting, of considering before judging, of choosing dialogue over provocation. I still feel guilty for many things I've done, and I may never be able to erase them all, but I've learned to transform that guilt into motivation to be a better person. Maturity didn't appear suddenly. It came gradually with each difficult conversation, each sincere apology, each gesture of care I accepted without resistance. Today, I see that being an adult means accepting responsibilities I once avoided, facing truths I once denied. My relationship with my mother, Rodrigo, and my brothers has improved considerably. It's not perfect, and perhaps never will be, but it's now based on respect and understanding, not fear or manipulation. I also realize that trying to control others only breeds distance. True strength lies in changing yourself. This learning process extended to all aspects of my life: school, friendships, personal choices. I discovered that growing up is painful, but every pain carries within it an opportunity for transformation. If I could speak to my past self, I would say, the world is not your enemy, and love is not a prison. Life doesn't have to be a game of manipulation to make you feel important. But I know I wouldn't have listened. Today, writing, this is my way of sharing, showing that change is possible, that even the most difficult behavior, when recognized, can be transformed. Overcoming adversity isn't about perfection, it's about self-honesty and the courage to rebuild what was broken. In the end, I can say I survived myself. I went through anger, pride, and emptiness, and came out the other side with awareness and maturity. I learned that respect, patience, and empathy are much more powerful weapons than manipulation. And, above all, I learned that true love isn't the kind you demand or manipulate, but the kind that gives itself, even when no one sees it, even when you make a mistake. Today, I am Lucas, but a different Lucas, more human, more aware, and ready to continue growing every day.
From victim to guardian of the family, I faced betrayal, lies, and discovered something that shocked everyone. I never thought my life could change so quickly. Everything seemed relatively normal before the whirlwind began. I was just Elisa, a teenager trying to balance school, friends, and the small family dramas that at that point seemed trivial. My mother had left us years before, and my father, Hugo, had always been protective, but the loss of my mother had intensified something in him that I only understood later, a constant fear of losing us. We lived an almost mechanical routine, between silent dinners and short conversations about daily life. I helped my father as much as I could, trying to be the daughter he needed to ease the emptiness, but I felt something was always lingering in the air. My sisters, Bruna and Camilla, were completely different from each other. Bruna dramatized every detail and seemed to follow every impulse of our absent mother, Regina, while Camilla tried to maintain a balance but was constantly pressured from all sides. Deep down, I felt an urgent need to protect the family, to maintain a fragile peace that seemed about to shatter. Until then, I didn't know that my life was about to be turned upside down by manipulation, intrigue, and accusations that we couldn't have foreseen. It was on one of those seemingly ordinary days that I realized the true weight of the situation. Sam, my closest friend and almost part of my family, was wrongly accused by Daniela, our obsessive relative, of things that simply didn't make sense. I felt a mixture of anger, frustration, and helplessness, because I knew he was loyal, upright, and a true friend. My heart sank every time I saw my father try to mediate the situation, trying to remain calm, while I watched the tension grow around me. Rita, my father's partner, struggled to provide us with stability, but it was impossible to ignore the venom that Regina and Bruna constantly poured on us. Every phone call, every unexpected visit, every snide comment seemed to slowly erode the peace we had built. I began to realize that my teenage life was becoming a battlefield, where I needed to act, but I didn't yet know how. I wanted to help, but I felt my strength was limited, that my decisions could cause even more chaos. The simple act of breathing deeply took effort, as the family tension began to consume me. The conflicts with my absent mother, Regina, intensified. She had a cruel talent for manipulating situations and pitting Bruna against me or my father. Every family gathering was a test of patience and emotional resilience. I remember one afternoon when I tried to explain to Bruna that the accusations about Sam were false, but she looked at me with those angry eyes and followed Regina's script. I felt a deep sadness, because it was my own sister becoming an accomplice in something I saw as unfair and painful. It was at that moment that I began to understand that protecting my family meant more than solving external problems. It meant facing my own limits, my own insecurities, and the feeling of loneliness that was growing within me. I began to feel responsible not only for the care of our home, but also for everyone's emotional sanity, a burden that seemed too heavy for someone my age. The tension didn't just come from the arguments, it came from the constant feeling of surveillance, that any slip-up could be used against us, especially against Sam and, eventually, against Matt, my boyfriend, who also got involved trying to help. The impact this had on me was enormous. I began to struggle to concentrate on my studies, conversations with friends, and even the simplest moments of daily life. It was as if a dark cloud constantly hung over us, and I had to walk through it, trying to protect everyone without losing my own identity. Hugo, my father, even though he tried to protect us, often seemed lost, torn between the fear of losing his family and the desire to move on with Rita. I, Elisa, felt the need to assume the role of mediator, a firm voice reminding everyone of the truth. But at the same time, I was learning the hard way how to deal with family intrigues and betrayals. Every step was an internal battle. I wanted to maintain harmony, but I also needed to assert myself, to show that I could not be manipulated or intimidated. The emotional pressure grew with each passing day, and I felt the weight of every look, every nasty comment, every family crisis. I began to realize that I was growing up too fast, that the adolescence I imagined was being consumed by a whirlwind of responsibilities and emotions that forced me to mature prematurely. And then came the day when everything seemed to explode. Sam was wrongly accused in front of the entire family, with Daniela and her siblings silently supporting his lies. Hugo was furious but tried to remain calm. Bruna was by Regina's side, as always, and Camilla seemed lost, unsure of where to stand. I felt a mixture of anger, helplessness, and despair, knowing the situation was spiraling out of control. That was the first time I felt I could no longer just watch or try to appease. Something had to be done. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, and a chill ran down my spine. I was afraid to speak out, to say too much, or to make a mistake, but at the same time, I knew I had to act. It was at that moment that I realized that overcoming grief wasn't about avoiding conflict or running away from pain, but about facing it head-on, even when all seemed lost. I needed to find strength within myself that I didn't even know existed, because protecting Sam, my father, my sisters, and, in the future, Sophia, our adopted baby, would become my greatest purpose. From that day on, every moment at home felt charged with an almost unbearable tension. I would wake up and already feel the weight of every look, every misplaced word. My mind wouldn't rest. I imagined strategies to protect Sam from unfair accusations, calm my father who was struggling with his own anxiety, and still try to contain the destructive influence of Regina and Bruna. It all felt like a daily battle, and I wondered how someone so young could handle such enormous responsibilities. Rita tried to help me, offering advice and emotional support, but not even her presence was enough to erase the feeling that we were surrounded by a constant cloud of conflict. Life felt like a game of chess, where every move needed to be calculated, yet at the same time, any mistake could cause irreversible disaster. I felt like I was carrying more than just my own life. I was carrying the need to protect the entire family unit. Camilla began to withdraw emotionally, likely trying to shield herself from the intensity of the conflicts. Bruna, on the other hand, seemed increasingly aligned with Regina, repeating her arguments without question. It was painful to realize that my own sister was being used as an instrument of manipulation, and at the same time, I knew I couldn't waste time trying to convince her or change her position. I needed to focus on what was truly urgent: keeping Sam safe, preserving my father's relationship with Rita, and ensuring the chaos didn't spread to the new generation we were building with Matt. Each night, when I finally lay down, my body felt exhausted, but my mind remained alert, imagining solutions, anticipating problems. The feeling that I was constantly in combat began to affect my sleep, my mood, and even my physical health. Regina's attacks weren't just verbal, they were subtle, manipulative, and sometimes almost imperceptible. She knew exactly which points to touch to provoke distrust, anger, or insecurity. I found myself replaying conversations in my mind, trying to understand every detail, trying to predict her next move. The feeling of constant alert began to wear me down emotionally, but it also awakened something new, an inner strength I didn't even know I possessed. Every injustice I saw Sam suffer, every malicious word that hurt my father, left me feeling a mixture of rage and determination. I couldn't control Regina or Bruna, but I could choose how to react, and that choice began to define who I truly was. I began to realize that overcoming obstacles began the moment I accepted that I couldn't change everyone else, but I could change myself. There were times when I considered giving up. The emotional pressure was so great that feeling fragile seemed inevitable. I cried alone in my room, feeling unable to bear all the responsibility. But whenever I looked at Matt, Sam, or even my father trying to remain calm, I felt a spark of courage. That spark became a guiding light on dark days, reminding me that my strength didn't need to be overwhelming, but constant. It was during this time that I began writing, as a way to organize my thoughts and emotions. Recording everything helped me notice patterns, understand my own reactions, and, most importantly, find more effective strategies for dealing with family conflicts. The turning point began quietly. One day, during a particularly intense argument between Bruna, Regina, and Sam, something shifted within me. Instead of simply listening and trying to mediate, I spoke clearly and firmly, stating the facts, defending the truth, and setting boundaries. The feeling of fear didn't disappear, but I felt for the first time that I had power over my own actions, that my voice could make a difference. It wasn't about shouting louder or winning an argument. It was about acting coherently, with integrity, and with courage. This moment, though simple, marked the beginning of an internal transformation that would be fundamental to the process of overcoming that I was still experiencing. I realized that facing conflicts head-on, with clarity and determination, was more effective than any attempt to avoid or minimize the problems. The tension at home reached an almost unbearable point. Every word exchanged seemed to carry an explosive charge, and I felt like any false move could trigger another conflict. Regina intensified her attempts to manipulate the situation, while Bruna followed her lead without question, and Camila remained silent, as if unwilling to get involved, but I knew her silence also weighed heavily. Sam continued to be wrongly accused, and I saw how his patience and integrity were tested daily. My father, Hugo, tried to protect everyone, but his fear and anxiety were palpable, and this put even more pressure on me. I knew I needed to act with greater strategy, clarity, and courage, because everyone's emotional fragility depended in part on my own stability. I spent days planning, reflecting, and searching for ways to protect our family without giving in to Regina's provocations. I began recording every conversation, every attack, every detail that could prove the truth and disarm the unfounded accusations against Sam. It was a huge effort, because it required constant attention, memory, and emotional control. At the same time, I had to deal with my own internal doubts. Am I doing enough? Can I really change the situation? Each question tested me, but also taught me something about patience, resilience, and the importance of believing in yourself even when all seems lost. I felt like I was growing, but in a painful way that forced maturity before its time. My relationship with Matt became a fundamental support. He was always by my side, offering advice, security, and unconditional love. His presence reminded me that I didn't have to carry everything alone, and that sharing responsibility wasn't weakness, but strength. With him, I was able to structure clearer plans, face difficult conversations, and deal with Regina and Bruna's manipulation more objectively. Sophia, our adopted baby, still small, gave me an extra reason to persevere. Her every smile, every innocent gesture, reinforced my commitment to keeping the family together, safe, and happy. I realized that overcoming was not just a battle against others, but a struggle to keep my own faith, courage, and love alive, even amidst the chaos. There were times when I thought all was lost. One afternoon, after a particularly vicious argument with Regina, my body and mind felt exhausted, and I almost gave up fighting. But in that moment, looking at Sam and remembering everything we'd been through together, I realized that giving up wasn't an option. Strength didn't come from external miracles, but from the conviction that our family needed me, that my actions made a difference, and that truth and love would always find a way to prevail, even when it seemed impossible. That moment of near despair became a decisive turning point, showing me that overcoming requires persistence and courage, even when fear dominates. From that moment on, I began to act with more confidence. I confronted Regina directly, exposing her manipulations and presenting evidence that disproved her accusations. Bruna finally began to question her mother, and Camilla, who had previously been hesitant, sided with us, offering emotional support and practicality. My father, Hugo, breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that our family was beginning to mend its course, and Rita continued to be the anchor of stability she had always been. Sam, strengthened by my advocacy and the truth, regained his confidence and began to live without the burden of unfair accusations. I realized that my journey of overcoming was intimately linked to the ability to act with integrity, courage, and love, facing chaos without losing the essence of who I am. After confronting Regina and dealing with Bruna's manipulations, I felt a slight sense of freedom. It wasn't complete, as there were still open wounds and remnants of mistrust, but I finally realized we were beginning to breathe without the constant tension we'd felt before. Camilla became more present, offering support and stability. And even Bruna began to reflect on her own actions, realizing she didn't need to blindly follow in the footsteps of our absent mother. Hugo, my father, seemed more serene, as if a cloud had begun to lift. Rita remained a pillar of love and calm, helping to remind us that life can be rebuilt even after so much chaos. I, Elisa, realized that my actions, my determination, and my love for my family had made a difference, and this gave me a sense of fulfillment I'd never experienced before. Sam started smiling more often again, and her presence once again became a relief amid the tensions that still occasionally surfaced. I understood that overcoming doesn't mean the total absence of problems, but rather the ability to face them with courage and clarity. Matt remained by my side, always patient, offering advice and reminding me that sharing responsibilities doesn't diminish our strength, but rather strengthens our bonds. With Sophia, our adopted baby, life seemed lighter. Her every gesture brought hope and reminded us of the genuine love that was still possible to build, even after years of conflict and pain. Her presence became a symbol of what we had achieved, a new generation that united us and motivated us to move forward. In those quiet moments, I began to reflect on everything we had been through. It was impossible not to remember the nights I felt like giving up, the tears hidden in my room, the physical and emotional exhaustion. But each of these moments taught me something about resilience, courage, and the importance of maintaining integrity in the face of injustice. I realized that overcoming adversity is not an endpoint, but a continuous process of learning and growth. My life had changed profoundly, and I was more aware of my own strengths and limitations. I learned to trust myself more, to act firmly, and to not allow manipulation and negativity to divert me from my principles and the protection of my family. Hugo finally began to make room for himself, allowing himself to experience a new love with Rita without guilt or fear. It was a learning experience for all of us, understanding that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting or betraying the past, but integrating past experiences and transforming pain into learning. Camilla began to demonstrate her own strength, learning to set boundaries and position herself in difficult situations. Bruna slowly began a process of reflection and change, even though it was still in its early stages. I realized that each family member had their own journey of overcoming grief, and that my role wasn't to solve every problem, but to support and protect, offering love, clarity, and stability. In everyday life, small gestures began to bring joy again. Family dinners, unexpected laughter, sincere conversations, and moments of complicity with Matt and Sam became points of emotional balance. Sophia, with her innocence and pure love, reminded us daily of the importance of continuing to fight, investing in family unity, and believing that overcoming is possible, even after the most difficult times. I, Elisa, felt a profound transformation. Not only had I overcome the immediate challenges, but I was learning to build a life with greater awareness, empathy, and courage. Each step we took together strengthened our bonds and allowed us to face the future with hope and determination. Over time, I realized that the tension that once seemed unbearable had eased. Regina still existed in our lives, but her manipulative power no longer had the same effect. I, Elisa, had learned to set clear boundaries, act firmly, and protect those I loved without losing myself in the process. Hugo allowed himself to live, laugh, and love again alongside Rita without guilt, and this brought lightness to all of us. Camilla found her own voice and began to face difficult situations with poise, while Bruna began to question old patterns, albeit slowly. Sam finally breathed a sigh of relief and rebuilt his life, without the weight of unfair accusations. Matt became an even more present partner, helping maintain the family's emotional stability and offering unconditional love. Sophia, our adopted baby, became the symbol of hope and unity that kept us strong during the most difficult times. Her every smile, every innocent gesture, reinforced that it was worth fighting, persisting, and overcoming. I realized that our family didn't need to be perfect to be strong. We just needed to support each other, believe in each other, and protect what truly mattered. My role as a mediator and caregiver had matured me in ways I never imagined, and now I understood that overcoming is a daily process, made up of small victories, quiet courage, and genuine love. The rebuilding process also taught me something valuable about forgiveness and boundaries. It wasn't about forgetting past mistakes or allowing injustices to continue, but rather about choosing where to invest our energy and how to preserve our peace. I learned to value my own voice, to trust my decisions, and to understand that not all conflicts need to be overcome through confrontation. Sometimes, strength lies in remaining calm and acting with clarity. Each challenge we faced brought us closer, strengthened us, and taught us the importance of protecting our own happiness without sacrificing our love for our family. Today, looking back, I see how much we've grown. Life still presents obstacles, but the constant feeling of fear has given way to a solid confidence in ourselves and our ability to overcome them. Hugo and Rita built a partnership based on respect and affection. Camilla and Bruna found ways to cope with their own weaknesses, and Sam and Matt became pillars of support and love. Sophia continues to remind us daily of the preciousness of building a home based on security, love, and hope. Every small gesture, every achievement, represents the victory of a family that has endured intense conflict and yet found ways to rebuild. In the end, I learned that overcoming is not a point of arrival, but a continuous journey. It's about rising even when pain insists on knocking us down, about protecting those we love without losing our true essence, and about believing that, even amidst the greatest difficulties, it's possible to find happiness, balance, and genuine love. Today, I am Elisa, a stronger young woman, aware of my choices and capable of facing life's challenges with courage. I've learned to value every victory, no matter how small, and to understand that overcoming doesn't mean forgetting, but transforming. Our family has found its balance, and I finally understood that true strength lies in the resilience and love that holds us together. My former friend almost destroyed my career and my life. See how I overcame it all. For years, I believed my life was under control. I would wake up early, put on my lab coat, and enter the hospital as if wearing invisible armor, ready to face any emergency. Medicine had always been my purpose, the reason for every choice I'd made in life. Every patient I saw, every correct diagnosis, gave me the feeling of accomplishing something greater, of leaving my mark on the world. However, as prepared as I felt for medical crises, I was nowhere near prepared to deal with what was about to happen. the persecution of someone I once considered a friend. It all began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow slowly approaching without you noticing. A simple text message, full of nostalgia and affection, was enough to open a door I never should have opened. At that moment, I didn't know it, but I was entering a nightmare that would shake my personal and professional life, shatter my confidence, and force me to fight for my own sanity and dignity. I still didn't understand that some people hide obsession behind smiles, and that friendship, when it becomes possessive, can turn into a silent and devastating weapon. My name is Rosangela. I'm 36 years old, and I'm a general practitioner. At the time this story began, my life seemed peaceful and balanced. A solid relationship with Kaio, my boyfriend, who always supported me, a circle of trusted friends, and my parents, Renato and Marlene, who were my emotional safe haven, always there to listen, support, and protect. I believed my world was secure, that the effort and dedication to my career had created a solid routine without any major external threats. I worked hard, but I enjoyed what I did. I found beauty in the little things: coffee with my parents, a simple dinner with Kaio, moments of silence that allowed me to organize my thoughts. I truly felt happy and complete. However, what seemed like stability was only a momentary illusion. Life has a cruel way of testing our strength, and sometimes the greatest threat comes from where we least expect it. Someone who shared your childhood, someone who should have been nothing more than a memory and affection, but who turned everything into a threat, surveillance, and manipulation. Rachel was my childhood friend. We grew up together, sharing secrets, dreams, and moments that seemed eternal. For years, we lost touch, and each of us went on with our own lives. When she reappeared, it was with a simple message: "Rosangela, I miss you so much. I saw you became a doctor. I'm so proud of you." In that moment, I felt a warm, nostalgic feeling, thinking about how time flies, how people can reconnect. I responded cordially, thinking it would just be a light conversation, reminiscing about the past, laughing about our teenage antics. But it wasn't long before her questions became invasive, excessive. Where I lived, my schedule, who I hung out with, even intimate details of my routine. Everything seemed casual, but something inside me began to signal alarm bells. I wanted to believe it was just the curiosity of someone who had been distant for years, but Rachel had an obsessive pattern that I still couldn't understand. Each message that arrived carried a strange sensation, almost as if she were testing boundaries, probing every aspect of my life, trying to find loopholes. I didn't realize it, but I was beginning to enter a cycle of surveillance that would transform my routine and well-being into an emotional minefield. Kaio was the first to realize something was wrong. He noticed subtle patterns, small coincidences that I hadn't noticed before. Rachel would show up at places I frequented, always with a smile and a plausible explanation, but always present, always watching. Comments on social media began to surface, fake accounts insinuating things about my personal and professional life, and I still struggled to believe someone could be so calculating. Every time I tried to ignore it, something new would appear. Flowers delivered to the hospital, constant messages, unexpected gifts, all designed to destabilize me and create a feeling of constant surveillance. I tried to rationalize, find excuses, believe in Rachel's good faith, but deep down, something inside me told me this wasn't normal, that the friendship had turned into an obsession. Fear began to creep in, subtle but present, eroding the confidence I had in my own judgment. The first direct attack came in the form of an anonymous email at the hospital. They accused me of negligence in a case that never existed. I was called in for clarification, and for the first time in my career, I felt shame and powerlessness over something I didn't do. My hands trembled, my heart raced, and I felt like all my effort and dedication could be unraveled by a moment of planned malice. The investigation found no wrongdoing, but doubt had already been planted. I began to realize that Rachel didn't just want attention or reconnection. She wanted to destroy. It was at that point that I realized I was facing something bigger than I imagined. The childhood friendship had become a weapon against my own life, and I needed to find the strength to face something that seemed invisible, but that was eating away at me every day. After the first attack, things only got worse. Small, nasty comments began to circulate among hospital colleagues. Insinuations about my professional ethics, rumors about my personal life, whispered doubts that spread like wildfire. No one knew where they were coming from, but I could feel the stares, the hidden smiles, the silent judgment. Social media began to be overrun with fake profiles spreading rumors. Some friends began to distance themselves, perhaps out of fear of getting involved or unsure how to support me. Rachel was everywhere at once, invisible and relentless, as if she were surrounding me without me realizing it. I began to doubt myself. Every notification, every comment, every message felt like a threat. I felt exhausted, vulnerable, and desperate, unsure of who to trust. Kaio tried to comfort me, but even he couldn't fully understand what it meant to be attacked by someone you once considered a friend. The feeling of being trapped emotionally and digitally was overwhelming. For weeks, I cried alone at night, asking myself why anyone would do this, how friendship could turn into stalking, and why it seemed like no one could see the truth. It was at that moment that Joseph entered my life. He was Kaio's friend and a digital security expert. Joseph began discreetly investigating, tracking the fake accounts, the emails, the manipulated messages. With each piece of evidence he uncovered, my heart alternated between relief and dread. Relief knowing Rachel was being identified, dread realizing how calculating and obsessive she was. It was with his help that I understood the extent of what I was facing. It wasn't just defamation, but meticulous persecution designed to destabilize me emotionally and professionally. The feeling of vulnerability was intense. I could barely sleep, my appetite vanished, and every sound or ring on my cell phone put me on alert. Even amidst the chaos, I began to organize myself. I learned that survival wasn't just about resisting, but also about planning, documenting, and seeking legal support. Joseph and the lawyer we hired became my technical pillars, while Kaio and my parents supported me emotionally. I realized that to survive this storm, I needed strong allies, strategies, and courage that I didn't yet know I fully possessed. The lawyer specializing in cyber harassment explained to me that the process would be long and exhausting, but necessary. Rachel had violated court orders, spread lies, and created situations that compromised my reputation. The feeling of helplessness, however, didn't disappear. Each new message from her was a threat, each new fake, a counter-reminder that the harassment wouldn't end immediately. I began to have anxiety attacks, feeling panicky when opening emails or messages. My professional routine became burdensome, not only because of work, but also because of the constant vigilance of what might be happening online. Kaio remained by my side, but he too began to feel the weight of the situation. Distant friends offered support, but few understood the extent of the harassment. I knew I had to resist, even though each day was a battle. Each morning, I woke up scared, but decided to face the day was a small victory. It was also during this time that Emily, Rachel's younger sister, contacted me. She was frightened by her sister's obsession and wanted to warn me about possible retaliation. During our conversation, Emily revealed details I couldn't have imagined. Rachel had been envious of me since adolescence, always comparing me to everything. And seeing my success, a silent, obsessive rage took hold. Hearing this was painful, but at the same time liberating. For the first time, someone from within that circle offered me perspective, an explanation for what seemed senseless. The information helped me organize my defense, and more importantly, understand that it was never my fault, that Rachel's obsession was unjustified, and that I needed to focus on my own recovery. Meanwhile, the attacks continued, but I began developing strategies to protect myself. I documented every email, every message, every suspicious behavior. I kept a detailed record of everything, knowing that the truth needed to be proven so I could get my life back. Therapy helped me deal with my anxiety and fears, and the constant presence of Kaio, my parents, and Joseph reminded me that I was not alone. The realization that there were people willing to fight with me gave me strength I didn't know I had. I learned, day after day, that resistance isn't just about enduring, but also about reacting with intelligence and courage. It was during this period that I realized that overcoming would require not only patience, but also strategy, support, and determination to rebuild everything that was being threatened. The turning point began when Joseph managed to gather irrefutable digital evidence against Rachel. There were screenshots of messages, IP addresses, audio recordings, and emails that proved the stalking, defamation, and manipulation I had been suffering for months. For the first time, I felt a mix of hope and fear. Hope because there was finally solid evidence. Fear because taking the situation to court meant confronting Rachel head-on and publicly testifying to her obsessive behavior. We hired a lawyer specializing in cyberbullying and defamation, who carefully compiled a comprehensive dossier, ready to be used in both civil and criminal lawsuits. I remember the first formal meeting with her. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, my mind racing with questions about what would happen if Rachel I's continued to deny everything. But the lawyer said something that stuck with me. "Rosangela, the truth can be temporarily silenced, but it cannot be erased. Now we have the chance to show its reality to the world." That was a turning point. I realized I wasn't just fighting for justice, but for my own sanity, for my right to continue my life without fear. For the first time in months, I felt a thread of control returning to my hands, and with it, the determination to face whatever came, no matter how difficult. As the process progressed, I still faced suspicious looks at the hospital. Some colleagues greeted me hesitantly, others avoided contact, as if wanting to protect their reputations before believing me. It was frustrating to realize that truth doesn't impose itself, that even in the face of evidence, social judgment sometimes precedes justice. But each day of patience and each respectful interaction strengthened me. I learned to carry myself firmly, to display confidence, even when I felt fear inside. Rachel continued to send provocative messages, but now I was prepared not to react emotionally. I learned to filter out the provocations, to keep my focus on what really mattered, justice and rebuilding my life. With each small daily victory, whether in court or at work, my self-esteem and confidence grew. The feeling of regaining control over my own narrative was liberating. I began to realize that my life could return to normal, even if gradually, and that the fear I felt no longer needed to dominate my choices. It was also during this period that Rachel's younger sister, Emily, became an unexpected source of support and information. She told me that her sister's obsession stemmed from years of comparisons, resentments, and insecurities built up since adolescence. Emily explained that Rachel could never handle my success, and that each achievement of mine aroused feelings of envy and anger, mixed with an irrational desire to control my life. Hearing the perspective of someone inside the antagonist's family was painful, but enlightening. For the first time, everything made sense. The attacks, the surveillance, the fake accounts, and the emotional manipulation were the fruits of a deep-rooted obsession. Knowing this gave me strength, because I understood that my responsibility was not to fix Rachel, but to protect myself, preserve myself, and seek justice. Empathy for Emily and clarity about the situation helped me better organize my strategies, strengthening me to face each new attack with confidence and intelligence. The case progressed, and Rachel continued to try to undermine my life in every way. I had to deal with the constant fear of new actions, new accusations, and unexpected retaliation. Each morning was an exercise in courage, waking up, facing work, looking people in the eye, and continuing to live despite the persecution. It was both an external and internal struggle. I had to learn to separate my emotions from what was rationally necessary to prove the truth. Every step I took, every record I documented, every contact with lawyers and experts was a reminder that I was on the right path. My social life, my mental health, and even my relationship with Kayo were put to the test. But with each challenge, I grew, learning resilience and how to deal with the complexity of a conflict that involved technology, emotional manipulation, and constant threats. The culmination of the struggle came on the day of the trial. I sat in the courtroom next to Kayo, feeling my palms sweat and my heart racing. Rachel tried to portray herself as the victim, distorting facts and manipulating the narrative, but the evidence was irrefutable. Every document, every recording, every message revealed the reality I had lived through: the obsessive stalking, the invasion of privacy, the defamation. When the judge handed down the sentence in my favor, I felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a profound emotion that almost brought me to tears. Justice had been served. It wasn't just a victory against Rachel, but a victory over the fear, anxiety, and sense of helplessness that had consumed me for months. For the first time, I felt like my life was mine again, that my story would no longer be distorted, and that I could finally breathe freely and rebuild my future without the constant shadow of threats. After the trial, the feeling of victory was liberating, but it also brought to light another challenge: rebuilding my emotional and professional life. The persecution had left deep scars, not only on my self-esteem, but also on my perception of trust in people and the world around me. Returning to the hospital wasn't immediate or easy. I needed to relearn how to feel safe, how to deal with the suspicious looks and malicious comments that still circulated discreetly among colleagues. Each step was accompanied by a mix of anxiety and determination. I began attending therapy regularly, learning to identify triggers and develop strategies to manage my anxiety. Kaio remained by my side, offering constant support and infinite patience. My parents remained my foundation, reinforcing that the truth would always prevail and that my dignity could not be shaken by the actions of others. Each small step forward, like being able to see patients without fear or returning to work meetings, was a significant personal victory. Over time, I realized that rebuilding didn't mean going back to how I was before, but rather evolving into a more conscious and resilient version of myself. I learned to prioritize my emotional well-being and set clear boundaries regarding any attempts at invasion or manipulation, understanding that my safety and peace of mind were more important than pleasing everyone or constantly proving my integrity. Kaio, my partner and unconditional support, was one of my greatest pillars during this period of reconstruction. He accompanied me every step of the way, not only holding my hand in moments of despair, but also helping me realize that my strength was present even when I felt fragile. There were times when he too was exhausted, but he never gave up. This partnership strengthened not only our relationship, but also my self-confidence. We began to resume projects and plans that had been put on hold, such as trips, get-togethers with friends, and even discussions about our future together. The simple act of planning something enjoyable became therapeutic, a way to rebuild normalcy and joy. Little by little, I realized that life continued despite the trauma, and that there was room for happiness, love, and fulfillment. The painful experience taught me the importance of carefully choosing who I share my trust with, but it also reinforced that healthy relationships, built on respect and reciprocity, are fundamental to weathering crises. At the hospital, resuming my professional career required courage. I faced curious looks, whispers, and silent judgments, but I maintained my firm stance. The hospital board, upon learning of the court ruling and all the evidence, offered a public apology, acknowledging the harm the harassment had caused. Resuming my daily duties and donning my lab coat again was a symbolic gesture of power and autonomy. Each patient I saw, each piece of advice I gave to residents, each small gesture of care reaffirmed my purpose in medicine and in life. Gradually, the attacks and gossip faded, as the truth had been proven and was now documented and legally backed. The feeling of regaining my professional and social standing brought me not only relief, but also renewed confidence in my ability to overcome adversity. One of the most memorable moments of this reconstruction was the reunion with Emily, Rachel's younger sister. She told me that Rachel had sought psychiatric help and was undergoing treatment. This information brought mixed feelings, sadness at realizing the depth of her illness and relief at knowing she was receiving care that could prevent further attacks. With Emily, I established a discreet communication based on mutual understanding and respect for boundaries. From this perspective, I was finally able to accept that I didn't need to carry constant anger. Rachel's obsession stemmed from her own internal issues, not my personal failing. This acceptance was a fundamental step in my emotional recovery, allowing me to focus on my life, my relationships, and my personal and professional growth. Experience has taught me that overcoming suffering doesn't mean erasing pain or forgetting the past, but rather rebuilding oneself with greater awareness, strength, and purpose. Today, I use my story to inspire others facing persecution, defamation, or digital harassment. I give talks, offer guidance, and share my experience to empower victims, showing that it is possible to seek justice and reclaim one's life. I learned to transform suffering into learning, anger into motivation, and fear into intelligent caution. Each step I took in rebuilding my routine, my mental health, and my professional life was a reminder that resilience isn't innate, but built with effort, support, and determination. Looking back, I realized that every tear, every sleepless night, every fear I faced was essential in making me the person I am today, stronger, more aware, and capable of protecting not only my life, but also my peace and integrity. Over time, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't just legal, justice, but rebuilding my confidence and autonomy. Rachel had lost the power she once held over me, but more importantly, I regained control of my own life. Every step I took to protect myself, every strategy I implemented, Every record of evidence not only strengthened me but also taught me resilience, patience, and assertiveness. I came to understand that extreme situations require planning, courage, and above all, the support of trusted people. Kaio, Joseph, my parents, and even Emily were indispensable pillars in this process. I learned that no one needs to face crises alone and that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, but rather of intelligence and self-care. This awareness became one of the greatest lessons of my journey. True strength lies not only in the ability to resist, but also in the ability to surround yourself with allies, understand the situation, and act with clarity and strategy. With each passing day, my routine became lighter and safer. I returned to seeing patients with enthusiasm, resumed interrupted projects, and regained the emotional stability that had been shaken. I learned to filter interactions, identify signs of manipulation, and protect my digital and emotional life. My relationship with Kaio grew even stronger. Each obstacle we faced together reinforced the trust and partnership between us. My parents, Renato and Marlene, continued to be my emotional foundation, always there to listen, support, and celebrate my small and large achievements. I realized that happiness, although shaken by external attacks, could be rebuilt with patience, care, and determination. This reconstruction was neither quick nor simple, but each step I took strengthened my resilience and my ability to deal with extreme situations without losing my essence. Today, I look back on that phase of my life with gratitude, albeit painful. It taught me the importance of trust, patience, resilience, and planning in the face of adversity. I learned that not all battles are visible and that victory can be silent but profoundly transformative. Rachel, although part of my story, no longer defines my present or my future. My life has become guided by conscious choices, the pursuit of emotional balance, and a commitment to protecting my integrity and well-being. Each challenge I faced became a lesson in limits, courage, and the value of allies who help us navigate seemingly endless storms. Reflecting on this entire journey, I see that overcoming obstacles is built on a combination of support, strategy, courage, and self-love. I've learned that life can throw up unexpected obstacles, coming from where you least expect them, but that it's possible to transform pain into learning, fear into strength, and persecution into opportunities for growth. Today, I feel more aware, resilient, and capable of protecting my life, my career, and my emotional peace. Experience has taught me that true victory isn't just about overcoming external problems, but also about rebuilding one's own life, strengthening oneself emotionally, and inspiring others to persevere in the face of adversity. My story is proof that, even when all seems lost, it's still possible to bounce back and find balance, justice, and personal fulfillment. What happened when my life was ignored by my own mother will shock you. Looking back, I can clearly see what my life was like before that episode that changed everything. It was a normal routine, but full of invisible tensions that no one else seemed to notice. My mother, Carolina, was always devoted to my older sister, Helena, who dealt with chronic health issues. I admired this dedication, but deep down, I felt invisible. I grew up as the youngest child, striving for attention with high grades and exemplary behavior, hoping somehow to receive the same care and recognition my sister naturally received. But it rarely worked out that way. Small frustrations built up silently within me, creating a resentment I couldn't even name. On the outside, everything seemed fine. I was studious, responsible, someone everyone considered mature for my age. Inside, I carried a constant feeling of emotional abandonment. My name is Raphael, and all of this happened when I was 17. I was in high school, planning to go to college, and at the same time, I was dealing with complex family dynamics. My older sister, Helena, suffered from asthma, chronic sinusitis, and fibromyalgia, and my mother focused all her attention on making sure she was okay. I understood the importance of this, but I couldn't ignore the emptiness I felt. I began to realize that my emotional pain had no place in that home, as if I needed to hide my problems so as not to burden my mother further. The feeling of always being in the background was overwhelming, and even when I tried to reach out or ask for help, I ended up feeling rejected or ignored. The first small tensions began to appear subtly. When I needed support for an important exam or was going through a personal difficulty, my mother was always too busy with Helena. Sometimes it was something physical. She forgot to take me to a doctor or couldn't believe the severity of a pain I was experiencing. At first, I tried to rationalize and be patient, thinking it was normal for her to be overwhelmed. but frustration snowballed inside me. I felt like my value was being ignored, that my presence and my needs didn't matter as much as my sister's. This feeling began to erode the trust I had in my mother and transform our relationship into something distant and fraught with silent resentment. Even with all this tension, I continued my activities normally. I studied, helped around the house, and tried to maintain my routine as best I could. But there was a constant weight on my chest, an anxiety I couldn't fully explain. I watched my mother dedicate herself completely to Helena and felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and guilt for feeling angry. The idea that perhaps I was exaggerating my own needs consumed me. This duality left me confused, unsure how to deal with my feelings. I often found myself crying alone or taking deep breaths to keep from exploding in the face of the situation, feeling increasingly emotionally isolated. Helena, my sister, was a constant presence of support, even with her own physical limitations. She understood my silence and, without saying much, tried to protect me from our mother's neglect. Our relationship with her was a refuge amidst the emotional chaos we were experiencing, but it didn't eliminate the weight of feeling like my suffering wasn't a priority. Each day seemed to reinforce the same pattern. My mother overwhelmed with Helena, me trying to survive emotionally, and Helena balancing what she could. This dynamic began to wear me down from the inside out, creating a tension I didn't know how to resolve until everything changed abruptly, with a medical emergency that exposed all the flaws we had ignored for so long. It was on a seemingly ordinary night that everything reached a critical point. I was experiencing intense abdominal pain, something I initially tried to ignore, thinking it was just a slight discomfort or something temporary. But the pain intensified, making every movement painful, and I began to realize I needed help immediately. I went to my mother, trying to explain the severity of my feelings, but she, absorbed in caring for Helena, interpreted my urgency as teenage drama. I felt my heart tighten as I tried to convince her that I couldn't wait. The already constant feeling of being invisible exploded into frustration and fear. I clearly saw her failure to see me as a priority. My sister Helena was by my side, trying to argue on my behalf, but she was also limited by the fear of burdening our mother. As the pain intensified, I began to panic. Each minute felt like an eternity, and despair began to take over. I felt my body burning with pain, but the worst sensation was emotional. The realization that no one truly believed me, that my voice carried no weight in my own home. I remember thinking that if something worse happened, my mother would regret it, but regret didn't bring immediate relief. The tension between my weakened body and my wounded soul was unbearable. That night was the culmination of our mother's involuntary neglect, and it marked an emotional breaking point that forever changed my relationship with her. Finally, after desperate insistence and Helena's interventions, my mother realized the situation was serious. We went to the emergency room, and the diagnosis confirmed my suspicions. Acute appendicitis, something that required immediate surgery. The mixture of relief and anger inside me was intense. Relief at finally receiving medical attention, anger at realizing how much my pain had been underestimated, and fear of what emotional neglect could have caused. The feeling of vulnerability was brutal. In that moment, I understood that my own life had almost been put at risk by my lack of emotional awareness, and that I needed to find a way to protect myself, even within my own family. During her hospitalization, my mother began to confront her own guilt. She was visibly shaken, realizing that her emotional overload had led her to neglect her youngest son. It was a difficult situation for everyone. She was dealing with guilt and responsibility. I was dealing with fear and feelings of abandonment, and Helena was trying to keep the family together. It was during this time that I realized it wasn't enough to simply wait for my mother to change. I needed to find the strength within myself to deal with my emotions and rebuild the trusting relationship. I began to reflect on what it truly meant: to be heard, seen, and cared for, even when those who should protect you fail. The first hours after surgery were critical. The physical pain was intense, but something inside me was shifting. I realized I needed to take control of my own emotional life, even if my mother was still learning to recognize my limits. It was a painful but necessary awakening. From that moment on, I decided I would no longer be a passive victim of emotional neglect, but someone capable of recognizing my own feelings, seeking help when needed, and setting clear boundaries for my own protection. This awareness was the first step in my journey of overcoming grief. In the days following the surgery, I began to notice subtle changes in my mother. Carolina was trying to make amends, showing genuine concern, but there was still tension and distrust between us. I needed to deal with the mix of feelings: anger, fear, distrust, and, at the same time, the desire to re-establish a secure bond. I discovered that, to overcome the silent trauma of neglect, I needed to confront my emotions, acknowledge that my pain was valid, and express it clearly. I began writing about my feelings, recording every moment of frustration, every fear, and every small step forward. This process became a method of personal therapy, helping me externalize what had previously been bottled up inside. Helena continued to be my anchor. Her empathy and understanding helped soften some of the most difficult moments. She supported me emotionally, reminding me that I was not alone and that my pain deserved to be acknowledged. My relationship with my sister became even stronger, and I realized that her presence was essential to my recovery. She not only helped me cope with my mother's neglect, but also taught me how to balance my emotions, understand the limits of emotional overload, and build patience without forgetting myself. The feeling of sisterly connection became a solid foundation for me to face the rest of the challenge. I began to reflect on my own responsibilities. While it was unfair that I had been neglected, I realized that passively waiting for my mother to change wouldn't solve everything. It was time to become active in my own life. I researched self-care, developed routines to monitor my emotional and physical health, and learned to communicate my limits clearly. Each small step I took strengthened my confidence and lessened the weight of accumulated frustration. I discovered that overcoming didn't mean erasing the pain, but learning to walk with it, transforming the experience into strength. The process wasn't quick. There were moments of relapse, arguments with my mother, and episodes where I felt invisible again. However, each obstacle I faced taught me something new about patience, assertiveness, and forgiveness, both for myself and for my mother. I began to realize that overcoming wasn't just physical or emotional, but also relational. I needed to rebuild trust with Carolina, but in a way that protected my well-being and recognized my own importance. The realization that my pain had value was transformative. During this time, I realized my mother was learning too. Carolina began to better balance her attention between her children, recognizing that neglecting Raphael benefited no one. I saw genuine efforts, but I learned not to rely solely on them. My own emotional autonomy became a priority. I discovered that while family love is essential, each of us needs to take responsibility for our own emotional care, and this realization completely changed my perspective on relationships and trust. Over time, my physical and emotional health began to stabilize. I still felt the effects of neglect, but I learned to identify the triggers that made me relive feelings of invisibility. I developed strategies to deal with similar situations in the future, communicating my needs more clearly and assertively. Each small step forward was a victory, demonstrating that even after a painful experience, it was possible to regain emotional balance and rebuild fragile relationships. A sense of control over my own life began to replace the constant fear I carried. My relationship with my mother improved, but gradually. Carolina acknowledged mistakes, apologized sincerely, and began demonstrating consistent care without neglecting herself. I learned to accept that she was also human, with limitations, but willing to change. This change, combined with my own inner strength, created a safer and more welcoming environment. I learned that overcoming grief involves both forgiving others and learning to care for oneself, even when those who should protect us fail. The experience also transformed my perspective on resilience. I discovered that it's not necessary to face challenges alone, but that inner strength and a support network can coexist. Helena's support, my mother's efforts, and my own determination combined to create a path to recovery. Each difficulty I faced became a learning experience, strengthening my ability to deal with future adversities. I began to see the value of clear communication, empathy, and emotional balance, applying these principles to other areas of life, such as studies, friendships, and personal projects. I realized that while the initial trauma left scars, those scars also carried valuable lessons. I learned to identify signs of emotional neglect, to express my needs, and to value my own well-being. This experience taught me the importance of speaking up, seeking help, and recognizing that feeling invisible or neglected is not a weakness, but a human condition that can be transformed into strength. Each step in rebuilding family trust was accompanied by small internal victories that gave me hope and courage to move forward. Looking back today, I see that overcoming wasn't just about surviving physical or emotional pain, but learning to navigate it, understanding human limits, and rebuilding relationships with awareness and maturity. I learned that it's possible to face situations of neglect, transform pain into learning, and create an emotionally healthier future. The experience made me more empathetic, resilient, and aware that my worth doesn't depend on anyone's immediate recognition, but on the respect I have for myself. The most profound lesson I learned from this experience was understanding the importance of emotional balance within the family. My mother's involuntary neglect didn't have to define my life or my relationship with her. I discovered that it's possible to overcome a painful past without carrying resentments that corrode the present. I learned that my role isn't to incessantly blame, but to acknowledge, cope with, and transform pain into personal growth. This understanding changed the way I relate to my parents, my sister, and most importantly, myself. Furthermore, I realized the importance of building honest and transparent communication. Before, I kept everything to myself, believing that expressing my emotions would be a burden. Today, I know that sharing feelings clearly strengthens relationships and avoids misunderstandings. My mother learned to listen to me. Helena continues to be my greatest ally, and I learned that my emotions are valid and deserve attention, even when the world seems distracted or overwhelmed. This practical and emotional shift created a stronger foundation for all of us. Another significant transformation was the ability to recognize and respect my limits. Before, I tried to absorb everything and please everyone, but now I understand that self-care isn't selfishness. It's emotional survival. I developed mental and physical health habits, created self-care routines, and learned to seek external support when needed. This process gave me more confidence, reducing the feeling of vulnerability I'd carried for years. Self-compassion became a central element of my journey of overcoming obstacles. The episode of Rohr's acute appendicitis and the emotional neglect that accompanied it taught me the importance of resilience, communication, and empathy. I learned not to rely solely on others' validation to recognize my worth. Today, I can look at my mother and sister with understanding and gratitude, even while acknowledging past failures. I discovered that overcoming doesn't mean erasing the pain, but integrating it into one's own story, using it as fuel for personal growth and empowerment. Today I can confidently say that I've grown emotionally, even though the pain and scars remain. I've learned that despite neglect or lack of attention, it's possible to find strength, set boundaries, and build healthier relationships. My story isn't one of perfection, but of humanity and resilience. Today, when I face challenges, I remember what I've experienced, what I've achieved, and how capable I am of rising above, even when life seems to leave me invisible. It's possible to overcome and rebuild, and that's the lesson I carry with me every day.